Chapter 232. Dang, dang, ding. The dull sound of the funeral bell came from the church in the center of Floral City. In the church, the Duke of St. Hilda's coffin was opened again for the members of the Morrison family to mourn for him. When the ceremony was over, everyone left the church with a heavy heart. The dead were gone, but the living had to move on. Colin and Vera calmed down and went to the Butterfly Castle under the lead of Count Morrison. The castle of the Morrison family was located in the southeast corner of Floral City, covering an area of more than 800 acres. The main body was made of solid granite, and the outer wall was made of precious white glazed rock. Looking from afar, it looked like a white jade castle. There were all kinds of gorgeous courtyards and rows of buildings in the castle. Of course, there was also the signature of the Morrison family, the tulips. From the most common white, red, yellow, to the rarest and most precious black tulips, they could be found here. The multicolored tulips decorated the Phoenix Butterfly Castle beautifully, giving it a lively scene. Colin couldn't help but take a deep breath, and his nose was immediately filled with the fresh and elegant fragrance of the flowers. Why is there a trace of blood? Colin frowned and turned to look at Vera. However, she didn't seem to notice anything unusual, and she was still intoxicated by the sea of flowers. Knight Roger, who was behind him, also didn't have any reaction, and Count Morrison was still enthusiastically introducing the relevant information about the tulips. Colin sniffed carefully again, and found that it was not an illusion just now, and the castle was indeed filled with a faint smell of blood. This smell may be hidden from others, but it couldn't escape the nose of the vampires. What's going on? Could it be that the tulips were the same as the blood roses, and they needed to be cultivated with blood? Colin temporarily suppressed the doubts in his heart and followed Count Morrison to the castle's inner court. After settling the guards and servants, Colin and Vera comfortably took a hot bath. When they were dressed, the butler of the Morrison family, Monton, had been waiting outside for a long time. "Lord Viscounts, the banquet is ready. Okay, please lead the way." Colin held onto Vera's hand as he followed the butler, Monton, through a long corridor before they finally arrived at the banquet hall. Hundreds of fragrant incense candles lit up the elegant and luxurious hall. However, the atmosphere of the banquet was not very lively. After all, everyone had just observed a moment of silence for the Duke of St. Hilda. The Morrison family didn't even have a band, so tonight's banquet was bound to be cold and solemn. When Vera held onto Colin's arm and walked into the room, everyone's eyes immediately focused on the Viscount's couple. Colin was wearing a wine-red Viscount suit, and there was a black tulip on his chest that was given to him by a servant of the Morrison family. It was a perfect match for Vera's black strapless dress. Vera's attire tonight wasn't too grand, and there weren't too many decorations on her body. Her golden hair was casually draped over her shoulders, and her snow-white and exquisite feet were wearing a pair of silver high-heeled sandals. There was a hint of laziness in her appearance. Earl Morrison hurriedly greeted Colin and his wife warmly and introduced several important people of the Morrison family to them. It had to be said that the Morrison family really had a fanatical love for the daughter of the House of St. Hilda. Colin had already greeted several ladies of the House of St. Hilda. However, they were all branch family members of the St. Hilda house. Even though their seniority was higher than Vera's, in terms of status, they couldn't compare to a daughter of the first wife like Vera. The only exception was the old Earl's wife, Grace St. Hilda. This Lady Grace was also the Duke of St. Hilda's aunt. Therefore, Vera had to address her as Grandaunt. During the rebellion of the lords of the northern frontier last year, the old Earl was publicly stabbed to death by Consudwa because he refused to betray the Duke of St. Hilda. After the news spread to the Butterfly Castle, Lady Grace insisted on going to Winter City despite the dissuasion of her family. She wanted to ask the Duke of St. Hilda for an explanation for her husband's death. As a result, the Duke of St. Hilda personally came to Floral City and attended the old Earl's funeral. He even became one of the 4 pallbearers. Many people thought that this kind of courtesy was because the Duke of St. Hilda felt guilty towards the old Earl. However, some people thought that the reason why the Duke of St. Hilda was so humble was entirely because of Lady Grace. In short, if there was a family that was least likely to betray the House of St. Hilda in the current chaotic situation, It had to be the Morrison family. This family had already been deeply entangled with the house of St. Hilda. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were a side branch of the house of St. Hilda in Floral City. Therefore, marriage was still useful, but the premise was that there were enough marriages. As long as you could make the wives of the important members of the other family become members of your own family, then this kind of bond would inevitably exceed the limit of interests. This was also the reason why Colin dared to accept the invitation of Earl Morrison to enter Floral City. Anyone could be roped in by the St. Thean family, but it was impossible for the Morrison family. Because time was too tight, I couldn't make it to your wedding, and I don't have any good gifts. I can only give you this bracelet that has accompanied me for most of my life. Lady Grace smiled as she held Vera's hand and tied a golden wheat bracelet on her hand. Thank you, Grandaunt. Vera's face was flushed. The meaning of wheat in the Empire of Light was many children, and it was quite appropriate to give it to the newlyweds. According to the customs, the bride generally needed something passed down from her mother or maternal elders. However, the Duchess had passed away many years ago, and Vera's biological mother had always been a mystery. At this time, Lady Grace's gift just made up for Vera's regret. Lady Grace smiled and patted Vera's hand, indicating that she did not need to be so polite. Then her face became serious. I am very sorry about your father's death. However, I am more curious about how he died. Vera told her about the situation at the wedding and added her own speculation about the Duke's death. Is it a forbidden spell similar to the Eyes of Petrification? Lady Grace thought for a moment and nodded. You guessed it right. It must be a forbidden spell that can kill a paladin. And it is very likely that the one who did it is Mr. C from the St. Thean family. I don't think so. Earl Morrison shook his head and said, casting a forbidden spell requires the sacrifice of one's life. However, Mr. C has been planning for so many years to take over the northern frontier, and he is about to succeed. Why would he be willing to exchange his life for the life of the Duke of St. Hilda at this time? I think so too. Scholar Dwayne nodded and agreed with Earl Morrison's words. If the St. Thean family was at an extreme disadvantage, then Mr. C might have made such a desperate counterattack. However, the current situation at the northern frontier, Scholar Dwayne did not continue, but everyone knew that the St. Thean family should have the upper hand in the current situation at the northern frontier. Lady Grace coughed twice to attract everyone's attention. She then sighed and said, perhaps, the cost of this forbidden spell is not borne by Mr. C. Scholar Dwayne curiously asked, Oh? Respected Madame Grace, could it be that you know something? Just before the banquet, I just received a piece of news. Lady Grace looked dignified. Fallen Eagle City has been burned to ashes a few days ago. What? Everyone was immediately shocked by this news. Except for Colin. Of course, he already knew about this news, but he never said it. Thus, Madame Grace's news did not surprise him at all. However, Colin discovered something else that was very interesting. Even Count Morrison had only just found out about it. It seemed that Lady Grace was the real master of the Phoenix Butterfly Castle. Chapter 233. The banquet hall of the Butterfly Castle fell silent for a while. Everyone was still digesting the shocking news that Madame Grace had just told them. After a long while, a series of questions came out from everyone's mouth. Are you saying that the entire Eagle City has been turned into ashes? What about the residents of the city? Are they also? Is this the price of the forbidden spell that you mentioned just now? Is the Oman family crazy? In order to support the St. Thean family, they actually burned their own nest to the ground? Madame Grace pressed her hands down and comforted them. Everyone, this news was sent back by a merchant that has a good relationship with the Morrison family. I have already sent people to Eagle City to check it out. I am afraid that we will have to wait for some time to find out what happened there. Only then did everyone stop asking questions. However, they couldn't help but let their imaginations run wild. They whispered to each other and discussed animatedly. Colin also temporarily put away the surprised expression on his face and asked Vera, can the price of a forbidden spell really be transferred to the civilians of a city? I'm not sure. Vera frowned. At least, from what I know, the price of a forbidden spell can only be borne by the caster. Scholar Dwayne said in a deep voice, but the one that killed the Duke of St. Hilda that day was a brand new forbidden spell. Therefore, it is very likely that Mr. Dwayne has developed a way to transfer the side effects of a forbidden spell. It is possible. Vera's expression became very serious. Everyone fell into silence. They had also come to their senses. If this was true, then the status of mages and the relationship between Yevil and the Empire of Light would most likely undergo an earth-shattering change. This is an inhumane evil spell. His Majesty will never allow such evil spells to appear in the Empire of Light. Earl Morrison's voice was a little sharp. Obviously, this forbidden spell was a great threat to every knight of the Empire. It could kill a paladin and, of course, it could also kill any knight. And the price for it seemed to be sacrificing some civilians. In the past, the nobles of the Empire were not too worried about the forbidden spells of the mages. Although the power of the forbidden spells was terrifying, it was still a means of exchanging lives for lives. As long as the mages were not forced into a corner, they would not fight to the death. However, if Mr. Feng was able to exchange the lives of the civilians for the lives of the paladins without sacrificing his own life, even if it was at the cost of a city and the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians, it would still be a terrifying thing for the nobles of the Empire. Such a forbidden spell was like the sword of Damocles, hanging high above the heads of every imperial knight. Colin and Scholar Dwayne looked at each other and sighed in unison. According to their previous analysis, the release of this forbidden spell in Fallen Eagle City was most likely approved by Emperor Reinhardt. The Emperor wanted to use this opportunity to restrain his uncle, the Holy Knight Prince Lacey. As for whether or not the Emperor's actions would bring trouble to himself, or even cause an even greater disaster, he could only wait and see how the situation developed. Madame Grace patted Count Morrison's arm, indicating that he did not need to be too alarmed. After we investigate the situation in Fallen Eagle City, I will send a letter to Imperial Dragon City and inform His Majesty. I believe His Majesty will not allow such an evil wizard to continue wreaking havoc within the Empire's borders. She then looked at Colin and asked, Viscount Angley, are you going to escort the Duke's body back to Frostwinter? Colin nodded and said, yes. Also, I am going to the Golden Lion Legion's encampment to persuade them to retreat to Frostwinter and temporarily avoid the rebel army. Madame Grace immediately frowned and asked, Viscount Angley, is it your idea to have the Golden Lion Legion retreat to Frostwinter? Before Colin could reply, Scholar Dwayne spoke first. Madame Grace, this is the Duke's last wish. Is that so? Madame Grace looked at the former confidant of the Duke with a playful gaze. Scholar Dwayne's expression did not change as he continued to explain. The moment the Duke received news that the Menham family had sent troops to the northern frontier, he had already ordered the Golden Lion Legion to retreat. However, before he could send out the order, the Duke met with misfortune. Madame Grace did not seem to believe this explanation, but she could not refute it. After all, the Duke of St. Hilda had spent the last part of his life in Icestone City. Apart from Scholar Dwayne and Angeli and his wife, no one could say that they knew what the Duke was thinking in his last moments. Colin saw that Count Morrison still wanted to say something, so he spoke first. Lord Count, I have long heard that the Morrison family's Phoenix Butterfly Legion's combat prowess is outstanding. Now that the northern frontier is in danger, is it time to send troops to quell the rebellion? Hearing Colin praise his family's combat prowess as outstanding, Count Morrison blushed a little. The Phoenix Butterfly Legion was not considered a strong army on the northern frontier. Furthermore, Charles's defeat at the front lines last year had caused the death of the Phoenix Butterfly Legion's elites. However, in front of Colin and Vera, Count Morrison could not directly refuse. He could only put on a sad expression and sigh. Lord Viscounts, of course the Morrison family is willing to send troops to help the House of St. Hilda clear out the rebels. However, the famine this time caught us by surprise. Without enough food, I do not dare to send out the army easily. Actually, Count Morrison was not deliberately looking for an excuse. This time, the famine in the northern frontier came very suddenly. Coupled with the fact that the House of St. Theon had secretly stockpiled food in advance with the help of the Tulip Merchant Guild and raised the price of food, It caused most of the lords in the northern frontier to be in a state of shortage of food. Other than the rebels who were already prepared, the only one who didn't have to worry about food was Colin, who had plundered the half-elf kingdom. At the beginning of the year, Count Morrison had personally gone to Icestone City to purchase food from Colin. At this time, Count Morrison was once again using the lack of food as an excuse in hopes of getting more food from Colin. Madame Grace also nodded in agreement. Viscount Angley, the Morrison family's food reserves are indeed very tight. However, our determination to support the House of St. Hilda has never wavered. How about this? I can promise you that if the Angeli family can solve the food problem of the Phoenix Butterfly Legion, then this legion will definitely appear on the front lines against the rebels. Hearing such a promise, Vera's eyes suddenly lit up. She excitedly held Madame Grace's hand and expressed her gratitude. However, Colin did not immediately agree. Who knew how big the food shortage of the Morrison family was? He did not want Angeli's territory to fall into a state of food shortage just to help them. Moreover, after Scholar Dwayne's analysis, Colin had already determined the most suitable strategic choice for the current situation: defense. Dragging the war into a stalemate, splitting up the vassal forces of the Sainthian family, and even finding a way to push Vera to the position of Dukes of the North first. This was the best choice. He did not want to take the initiative to fight to the death with the rebels. The Morrison family is indeed loyal to the northern frontier. Colin laughed as he flattered the other party. He then said carelessly, "How about this, Lord Count? You can first calculate the food needs of the Phoenix Butterfly Legion, then send someone to Icestone City to discuss with my butler Eamon." "Thank you so much." Count Morrison excitedly held Colin's hands. The Angeli family's help, the Morrison family will always remember it. Madame Grace seemed to have seen through Colin's perfunctory attitude, so she did not say anything more. Instead, she held Vera's hand and chatted about daily life. This old madam did not seem to be keen on taking the initiative to send out troops to fight the rebels. Colin did not mind. He raised his wineglass and began to entertain the gentlemen and noblewomen who came to chat. However, his mind was still paying attention to the faintly discernible smell of blood, trying to figure out its source. Chapter 234. The banquet at the Butterfly Castle ended at 8 o'clock. After returning to their residence, Vera took off her high heels and said to her husband, "Colin, Mrs. Grace just told me that Earl Morrison wants to marry Cousin Nina. She wants me to help her." Colin laughed on the spot. Scholar Dwayne had guessed correctly. The Morrison family really wanted to marry St. Hilda. Was this a perverted obsession, or was it a family tradition that could not be abandoned, or did they have other motives? Colin did not know this so-called Nina St. Hilda. However, even if her surname was also St. Hilda, it should not be enough for an earl to want to marry her. How can you help him? Now that the Duke of St. Hilda has just died, the position of the head of the family is vacant. Even if Earl Morrison wants to marry Cousin Nina, he will not be able to find anyone to make the decision. Vera was sitting in front of the dressing table at this time. She took off her sapphire earrings and said, "Mrs. Grace also knows that." She said that there is no need to rush this matter. After the rebellion in the northern frontier subsides, the position of the Dukes of the North will be decided. Only then can we talk about Earl Morrison's marriage. Colin looked at Vera as she took off her long dress, revealing her slim waist and long, slender legs. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, Vera. Did Mrs. Grace say anything to you about who will inherit the position of the Dukes of the North?" It seemed that Colin's burning gaze made Vera's face turn slightly red. She turned around and glanced at the man. She quickly changed into her silk pajamas and shook her head. "Oh, but shouldn't Joyce be the one to inherit the position of the Dukes?" Colin looked at his ignorant wife and suddenly realized that he should also have a frank and honest talk with her. Otherwise, she would not have thought that he could also fight for the position of the Dukes of the North. Joyce is not a marquis of the northern frontier. How can you say that it's a should? Vera was obviously taken aback by Jiang Yuning's question. But according to the order of succession, Joyce is indeed at the front of the line of succession. Colin untied his bow tie and threw it on the table. He then walked over to Vera and gestured for her to help him take off his suit. But Joyce is only 10 years old. Do you think it's appropriate for a child like him to become the ruler of the northern frontier? Vera was unbuttoning Colin's shirt as she raised her head and looked into the man's eyes with a puzzled expression on her face. Is there a problem? There's no minimum age limit in the Overlord law. Colin shook his head. I'm not questioning Joyce's qualifications to be the successor, but I'm worried that such an immature child really has the ability to deal with the current chaos on the northern frontier. Vera could not help but frown as soon as she heard Jiang Yuning's words. She stopped what she was doing, and it seemed as though she also felt that it was inappropriate for her 10-year-old brother to take on such a heavy responsibility. Then, who do you think can take on such a heavy responsibility? Vera asked in a trembling voice. Obviously, she also realized what Colin was trying to say. I think you can, Colin said in a deep voice as he looked at his wife with a pair of bright eyes. It seemed as though he wanted to convey his determination to her. Vera's eyes were avoiding Jiang Yuning's gaze as she held her husband's shirt tightly. She then asked in an uncertain tone, Can I? Of course. Colin pulled Vera into his arms and kissed her forehead gently. He then said solemnly, In my opinion, a qualified ruler of the northern frontier should have the virtues of justice, kindness, compassion, and tenacity. You have all of these virtues. Vera pursed her lips and hesitated. But I don't know how to govern the territory at all. That's all secondary. Colin waved his hand confidently. In terms of politics, you can ask Scholar Dwayne for advice. He is very familiar with how to govern the northern frontier. In terms of military affairs, Colin gave her a thumbs up and said confidently, You can completely trust your husband. Whether it is the eastern region or the trolls, I can easily deal with them. As for the rebel forces that are now entrenched in the northern frontier, there is nothing to be afraid of. Vera smiled as she looked at her husband's smug expression. The nervousness and fear that she felt earlier had subsided a lot. She stretched out one hand and stroked Colin's chest. She then drew circles on Colin's chest with her finger and said, Yes. My husband is now a great hero who has killed the Troll Emperor with his own hands. Colin laughed as he grabbed his wife's red lips and gave her a deep French kiss. He then asked, How is it? Do you have the confidence to become the Lord of the Northern Frontier? Vera lay on Colin's chest and did not speak. When Colin saw this, he spoke again. If you don't take the initiative to take on this heavy responsibility, aren't you afraid that Joyce's young shoulders will be crushed by this heavy burden? Think about it. Given the current situation on the Northern Frontier, do you think that a 10-year-old child will be able to cope with it safely? Vera was silent for a long time before she finally raised her head. The confusion in her eyes had finally disappeared and was replaced by a determined look. Well, if everyone thinks that I should inherit the title of the Duke, then I will definitely not refuse. Colin finally breathed a sigh of relief and smiled. This is what a real St. Hilda should be like. Vera's face flushed red and her tone became a little less confident again. But I may not be able to inherit the title of the Duke. Joyce's right of inheritance has priority over mine. What's more, we still have to consult His Majesty and the Senate. You don't have to worry about this, Colin said confidently. When he saw Vera looking at him with a puzzled expression, he had no choice but to laugh. I believe that His Majesty and the Senate will make the right choice. You are the real leader that the Northern Frontier needs right now. Colin, you have overestimated me. Vera stuck out her tongue and suddenly thought of something. Her eyes suddenly lit up and she suggested, Do you think that it would be better if Uncle Garcia becomes the Dukes of the North? Marquis Garcia? Colin frowned suddenly. If Vera was not his trump card, then Colin would definitely consider Marquis Garcia. However, if there was a chance to become the husband of a duke, why would Colin be willing to just be the son-in-law of a duke? Although Marquis Garcia had indeed helped Colin a lot, Colin would rather redeem Marquis Garcia and provide him with good food and drinks. Colin had just sent away a huge mountain that was pressing down on his head, and he did not want to create a new mountain for himself. The Duke of St. Hilda still has a son and an adopted daughter to choose from. Therefore, the Senate will not agree to let Marquis Garcia inherit the title of the Dukes of the North. What's more, I am afraid that the people of the northern frontier will find it difficult to accept a duke who was once a prisoner of the eastern frontier. No matter what kind of brilliant achievements he has made before, the shame of the Shadow Canyon. I am afraid that Marquis Garcia will accompany him for the rest of his life." When she heard Colin's words, Vera nodded in disappointment. "Well, you don't have to think too much." Colin kissed his wife's cheek. "You just have to be mentally prepared to bear this heavy responsibility. As for the rest, I will leave it to the Emperor and the Senate to decide." Vera nodded obediently, and also gave Colin a good-night kiss. The two of them then turned off the magic lamp and went to bed to rest. The sky outside the window was thin, and only a crescent moon was hanging high in the treetops, casting a faint cold light. After midnight, the windows of the butterfly castle were no longer lit, and only the corridor and the sentry post were still lit. The faint sound of an owl could be heard from afar, making the quiet night even more peaceful. "Vera? Vera?" Colin called a few times in his wife's ear, and when he saw that she had fallen asleep, he quietly got up, put on his casual clothes, and jumped out of the window. The air was filled with the fresh and elegant fragrance of tulips, as well as a faint smell of blood. Chapter 235. Taha. Among the heavy footsteps, a group of fully armed guards patrolled past. The light from the torches gradually dissipated as they went further away, and the courtyard was once again shrouded in darkness. In the shadows of the corner, Colin slowly quickened his pace. Following the faint smell of blood, he gradually came to the northwest corner of Phoenix Butterfly Castle. A strong stench assaulted Colin's nostrils, almost causing him to faint. It was the smell of horse dung. Only then did Colin realize that he had come to the stable. Damn it! Colin cursed in his heart. The smell of blood was covered by the smell of horse dung, and it was a little difficult for him to identify the source. Fortunately, this place was already at the edge of Phoenix Butterfly Castle, so Colin began to search around. Soon he found the source of the smell of blood again, the clock tower. This was an old clock tower that had experienced hundreds of years of wind and rain. The mottled outer wall and the vines that crawled on it were traces left behind by time. Clang. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, and the old clock tower let out a dull and hoarse sound. Colin hid in the shadows not far away, but he did not immediately go forward. Because, with just a rough check, he had already found 3 hidden sentries around the clock tower. There must be something wrong here. However, Colin was not confident that he could enter the clock tower without alerting the hidden sentries. Just as he was about to leave, the thick door of the clock tower suddenly opened. With a creak, a wheelchair was pushed out. The face of the man in the wheelchair could not be seen clearly, but Colin could guess the identity of the other party. Count Morrison's father, Franco Morrison. After the death of the old count, his son, Franco, was supposed to be the first heir to the title. Unfortunately, Franco was seriously injured in a battle many years ago and had been paralyzed ever since. Therefore, the title of count was passed on to his son, Sycan Morrison, who was the grandson of the old count. Colin looked at Franco's back as various thoughts flashed through his mind. In the end, he still quietly followed. Franco's wheelchair was not fast, and it was moving along the central axis of Phoenix Butterfly Castle towards the inner courtyard. Along the way, they met a group of patrolling guards, who immediately stopped to greet Franco. From their greetings, Colin also confirmed Franco's identity. After some distance, seeing that Franco was about to enter the main castle, Colin deliberately increased his footsteps and walked out of the shadow. Sure enough, Franco also stopped. "Viscount Angley?" Under the moonlight, Franco recognized Colin. "You are? Knight Franco?" Colin pretended to be surprised. However, this was indeed their first meeting. Franco did not attend the morning ceremony and the welcoming banquet. This night Franco looked to be in his 50s. He had a gloomy temperament, a thin face, long and narrow eyes, and thin, bloodless lips. Years of paralysis had ravaged this once famous knight of the Northern Territory to the point that he was extremely haggard. "You are?" "Oh, I couldn't sleep late at night, so I came out for a walk. I hope I didn't disturb you." Colin walked up with a smile. Sure enough, the smell of blood was getting stronger. Of course not. I couldn't sleep either, so I came out for a walk. Franco nodded his head and looked at his right hand. While Colin was puzzled, the maid who pushed the wheelchair explained softly, "Sir Viscounts, Sir Franco wants to shake hands with you." Colin then bent down slightly and held Franco's skinny right hand. It was cold and slippery, as if he was holding a dead fish. "I'm sorry, I couldn't attend your welcoming banquet." Franco smiled apologetically. "You're welcome." Colin quickly let go of Franco's hand and smiled. "You were injured because you fought against the trolls. You are a knight worthy of respect." Franco laughed self-deprecatingly. "I'm just a poor guy who was defeated by the trolls. You, on the other hand, annihilated 100,000 trolls outside the Howling Wind Castle and personally cut off the head of the Troll Emperor before the king's city. With such achievements, you deserve to be the hero of the northern frontier, the role model of a knight. If it weren't for my physical inconvenience, I would definitely give you the most noble knight etiquette." Colin waved his hand again and said modestly, "This is all thanks to the brave soldiers who killed the enemy. I dare not take the credit alone." Franco smiled, and then changed the topic. "Did Saiken tell you that he wants to marry Miss Nina?" Madame Grace did ask Vera to help the Count. Colin thought that Franco also wanted to help his son. Unexpectedly, Franco slowly shook his head. "Can you tell Miss Vera that she does not agree to this marriage?" But Colin was puzzled. Wasn't the Morrison family St. Hilda's daughter complex? Why did Franco not want his son to marry Nina? Franco's expression was a little gloomy. After hesitating for a moment, he asked, "Sir Viscounts, do you know why the Morrison family is obsessed with marrying the daughter of the House of St. Hilda?" Colin asked with interest. "You should have heard of the theory of blood purification, right?" Franco asked. Colin nodded. In fact, this was what Scholar Dwayne had told him. In short, people in this world believed that blood was an important determinant of the upper limit of the family's descendant strength. The reason why the Paladin family could continue to produce paladins was because of their noble and sacred blood. Therefore, the nobles of the Empire of Light had a period of time crazily chasing after the noble daughters of the Paladin family, trying to marry them and purify their own bloodline. However, the reality was cruel. Since the founding of the Empire of Light, the number of Paladin families had not increased at all. Those nobles who married the daughters of the Paladin family for several generations found that the strength of their descendants did not increase at all. On the contrary, the power of the Paladin family spread through the means of marriage. Their attempt to purify their bloodline only helped the Paladin family to consolidate their rule. Therefore, gradually, the nobles no longer diligently pursued the daughters of the Paladin family, and marriage became more practical. However, the Morrison family was an exception. It seemed that they still had not given up on the theory of blood purification and were still persistently pursuing the daughters of the House of St. Hilda. Franco said with a solemn face, "The Morrison family has been deeply poisoned by this theory. Due to the teachings of the ancestors and the traditions that have been formed over many years, the family members can no longer see the reality clearly. Therefore, I hope that you can help me to stop this tragedy from continuing." "Tragedy?" Colin was stunned. "This can't be a tragedy, right?" A painful expression appeared on Franco's face. "You may not know this, but I originally had 2 brothers. However, one of them died young and the other was born with a deformity. It was estimated that he could not live for more than a few years. He had to endure inhuman pain, so his father reluctantly killed him. And my child, Saiken, is not the only one, but his brothers and sisters. They are either mentally retarded or disabled. Therefore, the bloodline of the House of St. Hilda is no longer a gift to us, but a curse." Colin finally understood what Franco meant by tragedy. It seemed that the long-term marriage had gradually assimilated the genes of the Morrison family into the House of St. Hilda. As a result, although they were not close relatives, they were closer than close relatives. Thus, the consequences of incestuous marriages gradually appeared in the descendants of the Morrison family. And this evil consequence, in the eyes of Franco, who did not understand genetics, became a bloodline curse. "I will pass on your request to Vera, But I want to remind you that your mother values this marriage very much, so thank you so much. As for my mother, I will personally persuade her." Colin sighed in his heart. This Morrison family was really complicated. It was no wonder that their direct line of descent had only one son for 3 generations. It turned out that they were looking for trouble. After that, the two chatted casually. Colin found that Franco was quite optimistic about the current situation in the northern frontier. He believed that the current chaos was only temporary and it would not be long before it calmed down. Colin did not know whether Franco was deliberately being polite, or because he had been closed in the castle for a long time and was a little slow to the changes in the outside world. However, he did not intend to delve into it. He was more interested in why the other party entered the clock tower in the middle of the night. And why was that place filled with the lingering smell of blood? Of course, Colin also knew that such questions could not be asked directly to Franco, so he accompanied him for a while and then left. Looking at Colin's back gradually disappearing into the darkness, Franco suddenly asked, "How long has he been following us?" The maid who pushed the wheelchair shook her head. "I am not sure." Franco narrowed his eyes. His eyes flashed with a cold light, and he ordered in a low voice, "Add more people to the clock tower, sir." Chapter 236. Early the next morning, Colin said goodbye to Count Morrison. Count Morrison brought his family and personally sent Colin and Vera to the gate of Floral City. However, Colin did not see Sir Franco Morrison, whom he had met by chance the night before, in the farewell procession. The weather today was good. The sky was clear and the wind was not dry. Colin and the others sped up and headed south. In the evening, Colin ordered them to stop moving forward and set up camp to rest. After a simple dinner, everyone went to bed early. But as the night deepened, Colin sneaked out of the camp. When he came to an uninhabited wilderness, his body suddenly emitted a blood-colored smoke. As the smoke lingered, countless strange runes appeared in the air and then disappeared in an instant. At the same time, Colin's body gradually swelled. Poochie. A pair of black bat wings emerged from his back and then stretched out. Amidst the raging waves of air, Colin shot up into the sky like an arrow released from a bow, shooting in the direction he had come from. Phoenix Butterfly Castle. After Colin and the others left, the castle returned to its usual tranquility. Everything seemed to be the same as usual. Dinner started at 6:00 and ended at 7 o'clock. Count Morrison would patrol the castle as usual after dinner, and Madame Grace would go to the church to pray as usual. Knight Franco, on the other hand, would eat alone in his bedroom as usual. After 10 o'clock, the lights in Phoenix Butterfly Castle gradually extinguished as usual. Perhaps the only difference was that the southeast corner of the castle was brighter than usual. When the patrolling guards saw this, they quickly went to check. "Fire! Fire!" Immediately, the shouting woke the entire Phoenix Butterfly Castle up. Groups of patrolling guards rushed to the southeast corner of the castle. Count Morrison also immediately got up from the bed. He did not have time to put on his armor and rushed out with a knight's sword. At the same time, in the northwest corner of Phoenix Butterfly Castle, a bloody and strange massacre began. "What is it?" A guard in front of the clock tower seemed to feel something flying over his head, but when he raised his head, he could only see the dark night sky. Tonight, the sky was overcast, and the moon could not be seen. Even the starlight was completely covered. The guard turned around and was about to ask his companion when he suddenly realized that his companion's head was gone. The headless corpse was still standing in the same place, blood spurting out from its empty neck. He only managed to say half of the word "enemy attacked" before it was cut off. At the same time, his head was cut off. Colin threw away the head in his hand and walked towards the door of the clock tower. He tried to push it twice, but it didn't budge. Clang. Colin simply barged in. Such a huge commotion naturally attracted the attention of the surrounding guards. Colin soon heard a series of footsteps behind him. However, before the footsteps could get close, a series of screams and the sound of bones breaking could be heard. Colin no longer cared about what was behind him. He lowered his head slightly and entered the clock tower. There were a few torches on the walls of the clock tower, and the light from the torches illuminated the stairs leading to the top. However, Colin did not walk up the stairs. Instead, he lay on the ground and sniffed carefully. The smell of blood came from underground. Soon, he locked onto his target's position. Boom! The marble floor was smashed into pieces by Colin's foot, and his huge body fell through the hole in the floor. Boom! The drop was not big, probably only about 10 meters. Colin stood firmly on the ground. Although smoke and dust were everywhere, and gravel flew everywhere, he still opened his eyes wide and stared at the darkness in front of him. When the dust settled, nothing came out of the darkness. Colin's expression softened. He felt that he might have been too cautious. Flapping his bat wings, Colin flew up the clock tower hall, took a torch from the wall, and returned to the basement. With the help of the torch's light, Colin could see clearly that this was not a basement, but a sealed and damp cave. There were cold and hard stones on both sides of the cave. One end was blocked by a pile of rocks, and the other end extended inwards. He did not know where it led to. Since he was already here, Colin naturally would not be afraid. He immediately walked forward. After turning a corner, what appeared in front of Colin was a long stone corridor. However, the stones here were a little strange. They were actually emitting a faint light. Even without the help of a torch, he could roughly see the path under his feet. Colin continued forward. The smell of blood in his nose became more and more intense. Moreover, he could even hear the faint sound of water flowing. After walking for a while, the sound of water gradually became louder and louder. Not long later, Colin saw the end of the passage in front of him. A curtain of water hung down from the top of the cave. The water splashed in all directions, sparkling and translucent. Finally, it fell into a small pool at the end of the passage. Colin had never thought that there would be such a place hidden under the Phoenix Butterfly Castle's clock tower. However, at this moment, Colin was not in the mood to admire this underground river. Stepping into the pool, the ice-cold water did not slow down Colin's movements. He walked towards the curtain of water in large strides, as if he was sure that behind the curtain of water, there would definitely be a target he was pursuing. But the transparent and clear water curtain wet Colin's body. Behind the curtain of water was another deep and serene tunnel. The stone walls on the side of the tunnel also emitted a faint light, allowing Colin to see the path clearly without the help of a torch. Along the way, nothing happened. However, this made Colin even more vigilant. This was too abnormal. For a moment, he even planned to go back the way he came. However, since he had already come here, if he did not figure out what secrets the Morrison family was hiding, he would definitely not be satisfied. This family that had always kept a low profile in the northern frontier was definitely not as simple as it seemed on the surface. While thinking, Colin suddenly stopped. This was because he had already reached the end of the tunnel. There, impressively, was a huge sculpture of a butterfly. The insignia of the Morrison family was the golden-tailed butterfly. However, the tail of this butterfly sculpture was not golden. Instead, it was blood-colored. Colin looked at the blood-tailed butterfly in front of him and carefully approached it. After passing by this sculpture, he unexpectedly arrived at a rather spacious underground space. Just as he entered this place, a strong smell of blood assaulted his senses, almost causing Colin to suffocate. Considering his identity as a vampire, Colin increasingly felt that there was a terrifying scene ahead. Sure enough, when he clearly saw the situation in this underground space, his whole person was stunned on the spot. Blood. Endless and endless blood. The stone walls were covered in blood. The air was filled with the smell of blood. The ground, it was completely a huge pool of blood. Above the pool of blood, there seemed to be a huge spiderweb-like thing. And within this spiderweb, there were many cocoons. Within the cocoons, there were clearly living people. Traces of blood continuously dripped from these living people, falling into the pool of blood. Seeing this scene before his eyes, even as a vampire, Colin, who had the bloodthirsty characteristic, could not help but feel a bone-chilling chill from the bottom of his heart. What kind of azura hell was this? What did the Morrison family want to do? Bang! Just as Colin was in a daze, an armored man suddenly scuttled out of the pool of blood. Brandishing a blood-red longsword, he directly chopped down at Colin. Chapter 237. Boom. Blood splattered everywhere, and gravel flew everywhere. However, the blood was not Colin's, but was brought out from the blood pool by the armored man. At that moment, Colin quickly retreated, narrowly avoiding the armored man's slash. At the same time, he also saw the energy used by the other party. It was holy light. So, this was also a knight. The armored knight's sword missed, and he immediately approached again, stabbing at Colin's throat. Colin did not panic at all, because he had almost determined that the armored knight was a 4th-rank knight. Although Colin was also a 4th-rank knight, in the state of true body, ordinary 4th-rank knights were no match for him. Clang. Colin quickly blocked in front of his body with his arms. The blood traces on his skin seemed to be alive, emitting a heart-palpitating energy. When the armored knight's long sword landed on the surface, it only left a faint mark that was barely visible. Bang! A dark golden flash suddenly lit up in the cave. Colin's bat wings suddenly opened, as if he was flying. His huge figure completely enveloped the armored knight. With the sound of bones breaking, the armored knight's entire right arm was cut off. However, after suffering such a heavy injury, the armored knight did not make a sound, as if he did not feel pain. His blood-red eyes stared blankly at Colin through the holes in the armor, without a trace of human emotion or reason. At the same time, the armored knight's body quickly retreated, as if he knew that he was no match for Colin, and wanted to hide in the blood pool. Want to run? Colin sneered, and his bat wings suddenly shook. Under the turbulent airwaves, he rushed toward the armored knight like lightning, his hands crisscrossing like scissors, grabbing the other party's head. But at this moment, the blood pool suddenly exploded again. Bang! In the splashing blood, a huge red figure suddenly jumped out, holding a huge white shield in his hand, and rushed toward Colin. This time, the figure that appeared was more than 4 meters tall. His body was not inferior to Colin after his transformation. His whole body was like a giant tank, carrying an unstoppable momentum as he rushed over. Colin instinctively sensed danger. He immediately threw down the armored knight with the long sword in front of him, flapped his bat wings, and leaped backward. Rumble! In an instant, it was as if a volcano had erupted. The enormous power caused the entire cave to tremble. The stone ground suddenly exploded, and a large amount of gravel shot out like bullets, hitting Colin's body and even causing bruises. This knight with a huge shield was at the 5th tier. The original armored knight took this opportunity to dive back into the blood pool and disappeared. Before Colin could regain his footing, the newly appeared armored knight pulled out a white spear from behind the giant shield. The tip of the long spear suddenly lit up with a trace of blood. Hiss! Lines of blood suddenly shot out from the blood pool and converged at the tip of the spear. The entire spear turned red in an instant, and a demonic blood light constantly circulated. It looked as if it was made of blood. An indescribable aura rapidly spread in the cave, and a heart-palpitating pressure instantly filled the entire place. Colin's pupils shrank slightly as he faintly sensed danger. Suddenly, an incantation of unknown meaning was uttered. Colin's scalp went numb. There was no time to think. The blood chi in his body rapidly surged, and the bat wings on his back suddenly flapped. The blood-red spear stabbed out like lightning. A circle of blood-red halo was like a ring-shaped ripple that instantly dispersed into the surrounding space. Wherever the halo went, everything was split into 2 halves. Colin was still in midair, but suddenly, streaks of blood appeared on his body, as if he had been dismembered by countless tiny blades. Bang! Colin was sent flying, and crashed into the wall of the cave with a loud bang. Thump! 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 The armored knight raised his giant shield and spear, and his entire body was like a charging tank, quickly approaching Colin. His heavy footsteps caused the entire cave to tremble. Colin didn't even think about it. With a flap of his bat wings, he rushed out of the tunnel he had come from. The narrow terrain here couldn't make full use of his mobility advantage. Moreover, that strange blood pool clearly had an additional effect on the armored knight's strength. Colin naturally had to change the battlefield. Seeing Colin running away, the armored knight suddenly let out a strange scream that didn't seem human, and immediately chased after Colin's figure into the tunnel. Waiting until the footsteps of the two people were getting farther and farther away, the cave regained its tranquility. Only the blood people in the cocoons above the blood pool seemed to be wriggling slightly, letting out faint moans. Splash! Amidst the surging blood, the armored knight who had rushed out the first time once again emerged from the water. He silently walked towards his broken arm, picked it up, and put it back on his body, as if he felt that he could recover in this way. Then he walked back to the blood pool in a daze, and slowly sank into it. Outside the clock tower, more and more guards of the Morrison family had gathered, but they were still blocked by a group of mysterious people covered in armor, unable to take a step closer to the clock tower. Not far away, Franco Morrison sat in a wheelchair, frowning as he looked at the battle in front of him, and said in a deep voice, "Is that big guy at the 5th rank?" The maid pushing the wheelchair nodded, and added, "And he's a 5th rank warrior. Troll warrior?" Franco's brows furrowed even tighter. Why would they appear in Phoenix Butterfly Castle? There was no response from behind. Clearly, the maid didn't know how to answer this question. This group of invaders were all professionals. If they wanted to sneak into Flower Talk City, it wouldn't be difficult. Franco looked for a while, and then decisively ordered, "Inform Sai, ignore the fire in front, and immediately bring people to the clock tower." Just as the maid was about to turn and leave, she heard Franco add, "Also, let him mobilize the city defense army to surround Phoenix Butterfly Castle. The enemy this time might not be easy to deal with." At this moment, the side wall of the clock tower collapsed, and a huge figure rushed out from it. Immediately after, another blood-colored figure chased out. However, after leaving the clock tower, Colin was no longer restricted by space. With a flap of his bat wings, he rushed into the sky, leaving behind the armored knights behind him, who raised their huge shields and spears, and helplessly roared at the sky. What the hell is this? Franco was dumbfounded. Phoenix Butterfly Castle had been peaceful for over 100 years. Why would a group of inexplicable invaders suddenly appear? Colin stood in the air, looking at the Blood Shadow guards fighting with the guards of the Morrison family below, and then looking at the guards of Phoenix Butterfly Castle gathering in the distance. He understood that today's investigation would have to stop here. Otherwise, when more guards surrounded them, or even the city defense army was mobilized, it would be difficult for them to leave. Although he didn't completely understand what the Morrison family was doing in the secret realm below the clock tower, at least he knew that there was definitely a big problem with this Morrison family. His main goal now was to pacify the internal strife in the northern frontier and push Vera to the position of Duchess. For the time being, it wasn't good to complicate matters. Therefore, taking advantage of the fact that the Morrison family's army had not yet formed an encirclement, he immediately ordered the Blood Shadow guards to retreat. At the same time, he also flapped his bat wings and flew away. The blood slaves immediately rushed towards the walls of Phoenix Butterfly Castle under the lead of Prince Malvi. Rumble! The tall wall was like a piece of paper under the impact of the heavily armored Prince Malvi, and in an instant, a large hole was smashed open. A group of Blood Shadow guards filed out of the large hole and quickly disappeared into the darkness of the night. Chapter 238. The flames in the fireplace flickered and crackled from time to time. Sitting in his wheelchair, Franco looked at the pitch-black night sky outside the window in a daze. It was the darkest moment before dawn. The curtain of night shrouded the land, quietly hiding the slaughter, sin, and blood. Footsteps sounded behind him, but Franco didn't turn around. "Father, the fire has been completely extinguished. The chaos in Phoenix Butterfly Castle has also been completely quelled." Count Morrison came behind the wheelchair and reported softly. Franco still looked outside the window and said expressionlessly, "Did you find out the details of the enemy?" Count Morrison shook his head and said with a grave expression, "No, they didn't. These invaders didn't fear death. We didn't catch a single one alive. However, the invaders we killed were all professionals. There were troll warriors, human knights, and of course, warriors. Someone even recognized a knight from the east." Franco's brows furrowed deeply. He suddenly felt that everything in front of him had become complicated and confusing. He couldn't figure it out at all. At that moment, heavy footsteps sounded again. Very quickly, a knight of the Morrison family appeared in the meeting hall and reported loudly, "Sir, I've been waiting for a long time. Sir Count, the invaders we killed came back to life and all of them escaped." "What?" Count Morrison couldn't believe his ears. "Say that again." The knight had no choice but to repeat it. At that moment, Franco slowly retracted his gaze from outside the window and looked at the knight with a sharp gaze. He said coldly, "What do you mean by come back to life? Tell me about it." The knight was sweating profusely. He knew that what he said was too outrageous. He could only brace himself and explain. "Sir, I am willing to swear in the name of my ancestors that what I said just now wasn't a lie. Originally, we had already collected the corpses of the invaders and were preparing to deal with them together. But in the blink of an eye, these corpses suddenly came back to life and killed the guards around them. Such a strange thing scared the guards out of their wits and they didn't dare to stop it. So, they escaped from Phoenix Butterfly Castle. Are you sure that those invaders are already corpses?" Faced with Franco's spiritual interrogation, the knight was dumbfounded. He couldn't possibly say that he was lying motionless on the ground with a few swords stuck in his chest. Wasn't that a corpse? Franco narrowed his eyes and thought for a moment. Then he ordered the maid behind him, "Cadina, go and interrogate those guards yourself. Find out what happened." "Sir." The maid nodded and walked to the knight's side. She crooked her finger and motioned for him to follow her out. The knight hurriedly bowed to Count Morrison and Franco as if he had been pardoned and followed Cadina out of the meeting hall. "Father, what's going on?" The series of events that happened tonight made the young Count Morrison lose his head out of fear. Even his voice was trembling. Franco looked at his son, who was panicking, and scolded him, "Why are you panicking?" Count Morrison hurriedly lowered his head and forced his wandering gaze to focus on his feet, not daring to meet his father's sharp gaze. The atmosphere in the hall instantly froze. It was so quiet that one could almost hear Count Morrison's rapid heartbeat. After a long while, when Count Morrison's heartbeat finally calmed down, Franco's deep voice sounded once more. "Do you know the Winged Knight?" "Winged Knight?" Count Morrison was stunned for a moment before he came back to his senses. "Are you talking about the knight who appeared in Silvery Moon City and killed the previous half-elf king?" Franco nodded. "According to the information I received, the monster that flew out of the clock tower tonight should be the new Winged Knight." Count Morrison thought for a moment and said hesitantly, "Father, then which faction does this Winged Knight belong to? Why did he come to Phoenix Butterfly Castle?" Franco pondered for a moment and said, "I suspect that this Winged Knight should be an assassin secretly cultivated by the Angeli family." "The Angeli family?" Count Morrison exclaimed. "Viscount Angeli just left Phoenix Butterfly Castle, and this Winged Knight came right after. How could it be so coincidental? Moreover, Viscount Angeli was also present when the coup happened in Silvery Moon City. If it happened once, it might be a coincidence, but if it happened twice, there must be some sort of connection." Hearing Franco's explanation, Count Morrison nodded in agreement, but immediately after, his expression became panicked again. "Father, if this was really arranged by Viscount Angeli, then he must know about the situation below the clock tower. What should we do?" Franco didn't say anything and only looked at his son coldly. Only when he calmed down again did he say indifferently, "So what if he saw the situation below the clock tower? Does he know what it is? Moreover, does the Angeli family not have any secrets? Winged Knights, and those suspected unkillable professionals. I think the Angeli family has no less things hidden in the dark than us. Moreover, his main target now is the Saint Thean family. He can't possibly provoke us at this time." Only then did Count Morrison feel a lot more at ease. He let out a long sigh and thought for a moment before asking. After thinking for a moment, he asked, "Father, then should we still send an envoy to Ice Stone City to discuss the matter of supplying food and sending troops?" "Why not?" Franco said indifferently, "Don't make a fuss just because the other party saw your secret. It's still hard to say whether the Angeli family is our friend or foe." You should know that sometimes, letting the other party know a bit of your secret will instead make it easier to gain trust. Alright, I will send an envoy to Ice Stone City tomorrow. Just as Count Morrison finished speaking, a figure appeared at the entrance of the hall. Seeing that it was Madame Grace's maid, Franco asked, "Mother was also startled awake?" "Yes, Madame wants to know what happened." Franco turned to look at Count Morrison and ordered, "Sycan, go explain to Mother." "Yes, Father," Count Morrison hurriedly replied. Not long after they left, Franco's maid, Cadina, appeared again. "Sir, I personally asked. Those invaders actually didn't all come back from the dead. There were still 3 corpses left at the scene. That's why I suspect that those invaders who escaped were actually playing dead. A bunch of idiots. Don't they know how to add salt to the wound?" Franco cursed in a low voice and no longer bothered with the matter. He turned and ordered, "In the name of the Count, issue a gag order. Everything that happened tonight is not to be leaked. Sir, come, push me to the bottom of the clock tower to take a look." Cadina obeyed and walked behind Franco, pushing the wheelchair outside. At this time, the castle had gradually regained its calm. Only the patrolling guards still had some panic and nervousness on their faces. The fire had been completely extinguished long ago, but the property losses were still being calculated. In the pitch-black night, suppressed cries could be heard from time to time. It was likely that they had lost their companions and family members in this battle. Franco arrived at the clock tower amidst the creaking sound of the wooden wheel. At this time, the door of the clock tower had been completely damaged. A large hole had also been smashed into the floor of the tower, like a deep and terrifying giant mouth that wanted to swallow all living things in the vicinity. Cadina, the maid, pushed the wheelchair to the hole. Seeing that Franco nodded, she picked up the wheelchair and jumped down. Chapter 239. "Colin, did you not sleep well last night?" Vera looked at Colin, who was yawning, and asked with concern. At the same time, she handed over a roasted deer leg. Colin took it and said with a smile, "It's nothing. I was awakened by a few mosquitoes in the middle of the night, and I couldn't sleep after that." "Then do you want to take a nap in the afternoon?" "No, I will continue my journey after lunch. The earlier I withdraw from the Golden Lion Legion, the earlier I can feel at ease." Vera no longer tried to persuade Colin, and she handed him a few pieces of white bread. Scholar Dwayne's eyes flashed because he saw that when Colin reached out to take the food, there were several obvious scratches on his arm. However, he didn't ask anything. Smart people were like this. Even if they saw the problem, they knew that they shouldn't ask. In fact, Colin also noticed Scholar Dwayne's gaze, but when he saw that the other party pretended not to see it, he took a bite of the roasted deer meat and took the initiative to speak. "Scholar Dwayne, what kind of family do you think the Morrison family is?" Scholar Dwayne paused and said, "Lord Viscounts, I think that the Morrison family has the qualities that an excellent family should have: loyalty, humility, and pragmatism." Colin pondered over the 3 comments given by Scholar Dwayne, and he seemed to have some ideas in his mind. Obviously, the 3 adjectives given by Scholar Dwayne were not chosen randomly. First, loyalty. This meant that the Morrison family was deeply involved with the House of St. Hilda, and there was basically no room for betrayal. Second, humility. This implied that the Morrison family was low-key and not well known in the northern frontier. Finally, pragmatism. This was also the most interesting comment. Would a pragmatic family insist on marrying the daughter of the House of St. Hilda generation after generation, knowing that the bloodline purification theory was not feasible? Especially when such behavior had already caused the Morrison family to suffer from the bloodline curse. Obviously, it was impossible. Therefore, the Morrison family was obsessed with the daughter of the House of St. Hilda, and there must be a deeper reason. Thinking back to the horrifying scene he saw under the Phoenix Butterfly Castle's clock tower last night, Colin suddenly had some guesses. Scholar Dwayne seemed to have seen through some of Colin's thoughts, and advised, "Lord Viscounts, I think you should be more concerned about the Morrison family now." "Oh, which clan do you think it should be?" "The Oman clan," Scholar Dwayne said decisively. Colin mulled over the name of his old rival's family. "What do you think?" Lord Viscounts, you must have heard the news of Fallen Eagle City's destruction in Phoenix Butterfly Castle. Clearly, the Oman family has been abandoned by the St. Thean family. No, to be more precise, they have been sacrificed. Earl Oman will no longer be loyal to the House of St. Thean, and his soldiers will definitely hate the House of St. Thean for destroying their home. So, this is our chance. You want to rope in the Oman family? Colin frowned. He did not wish for Earl Oman to be on the same side as him. Wouldn't that mean that he would not be able to avenge his predecessor? Furthermore, Count Alman, that old bastard, Colin did not feel at ease leaving his back to him. Scholar Dwayne did not seem too keen on roping in the Oman family, and said calmly, I only feel that we can give it a try. However, I suspect that the St. Thean family already has a plan against the Oman family. They will definitely not let their newly established enemy turn around and join the House of St. Hilda. So, we should first confirm the situation of Earl Oman and his family's army. If he has not been harmed by the St. Thean family, then we can indeed rope him in and take advantage of the opportunity to disintegrate the power of the St. Thean family. Colin nodded and did not say anything, nor did he express his agreement to Scholar Dwayne's suggestion. Scholar Dwayne seemed to want to say something, but he suddenly felt that the surrounding temperature had dropped significantly. A gentle breeze blew past, bringing with it a burst of frost. The bonfire in front of them began to flicker, as if it would be extinguished in the next second. Something is wrong. Colin immediately stood up, threw away the deer leg and grabbed the sword at his waist. It's an arcane fluctuation. Vera shouted in surprise. There is a sorcerer casting a spell. Moreover, it is an extremely powerful sorcerer. Alert! Search the surroundings. Knight Roger immediately shouted loudly, and at the same time, he sent out a small group of cavalrymen to try and find the sorcerer who was casting the spell. In the blink of an eye, the originally clear skies suddenly became densely covered with dark clouds. It was as if a rainstorm was about to start. He is in the forest in the west. Vera suddenly pointed and shouted, Quick! Stop him! In the midst of the rapid sound of horse hooves, a group of cavalrymen rushed in the direction that Vera had pointed out. However, before they could find the sorcerer who was hiding in the dark and casting the spell, a bolt of lightning suddenly flashed across the sky. Boom! What followed was a dull sound of thunder. After that, snowflakes began to fall from the sky. That's it? Colin and the others, who were originally waiting for the sorcerer, were suddenly dumbfounded. Looking at the other party's formation, they thought that it was some kind of terrifying spell, but they never expected that it was just a snowstorm. Of course, being able to create a heavy snowstorm in the early summer was also considered a skill. At this time, the cavalrymen who rushed over had already found the sorcerer and immediately escorted him to Colin. Teacher Cusius? Why are you here? Vera suddenly exclaimed in surprise when she saw the person who had come. No wonder she had felt a very familiar aura just now. It turned out that her teacher was casting the spell. Miss Vera, Viscount Angley, don't be nervous. I am just joking with you. Cusius had a calm expression on his face even though the cavalrymen were pointing their swords at his back. He even had the mood to joke around. Colin looked at the high-level sorcerer and his heart was slightly moved, but on the surface, he had a welcoming attitude. He smiled and shook hands with the other party. Mr. Cusius, right? I am so lucky to be able to meet you here. Vera has always told me that you have taught her a lot of things in Yevil, and I have always wanted to find an opportunity to thank you in person for taking care of her. Viscounts, you are too polite. I hope that my joke did not cause too much trouble for you. Of course not. Would you like to have a meal together? It is my pleasure. Cusius did not stand on ceremony with Colin. He walked over to the campfire and directly grabbed a piece of roasted venison from the barbecue grill and put it in his mouth. It tastes good. As he ate, he gave a thumbs up and praised. Teacher, what are you doing in the northern frontier this time? Vera poured a glass of red wine and handed it over. Cusius took the glass and drank it in one gulp. After that, he burped in satisfaction and said casually, I am here to travel and also to see my friends in the northern frontier. Of course, I also want to see you, my good disciple. You have been away from Yevil for more than a year now, but you have not fallen behind in your studies, right? Do you still remember all your magic knowledge? Of course I remember, Vera said immediately, but she did not sound very confident. Cusius saw through her at a glance and immediately began to examine Vera's arcane knowledge. Colin looked on coldly from the side, and his vigilance did not decrease at all. The timing of Cusius' appearance was too coincidental. Moreover, according to Vera, this person was a close friend of Mr. Feng from the St. Thean family. Even the forbidden spell that Mr. Feng had used to kill the Duke of St. Hilda by sacrificing the entire Eagle City was suspected to be an improved version of a forbidden spell called Petrifying Eyes that Cusius had once collected. Under such circumstances, Colin did not believe that Cusius really did not know anything about what had happened in Eagle City. He also did not believe that the other party would suddenly appear here without any ulterior motives. Of course, Colin would not chase him away. After all, he was still Vera's teacher. Moreover, a mage who was hiding in the dark was the scariest. A mage like Cusius who was actively exposing himself was not much of a threat. Chapter 240. At the end of May, the temperature in the northern frontier was quite high. However, there was a layer of ice on the Rapids River. Hey, Sir Viscounts, I told you we could definitely cross. On the solid ice, Wizard Cusius was jumping up and down, showing Colin that there was no problem with his masterpiece. Colin smiled and waved his hand to Knight Roger. Let's cross. Knight Roger obeyed and began to organize the cavalry to cross the river. At the same time, he was also on guard against the Dawson family sentries. However, Colin's group was not a big target, and they were all cavalry that came and went like the wind. Although the Dawson family was on the north bank of the Rapids River, they could not completely seal off the entire river. Of course, it would be different if it was an army crossing the river. This was also why Colin only brought 1,000 light cavalry. If there were too many people, they would be intercepted by the Dawson family if they wanted to cross the river. It might even lead to a fierce battle. After crossing the Rapids River, Colin's group met the sentries of the Golden Lion Legion after half a day. After revealing their identities, the sentries led Colin's group to the Golden Lion Legion's encampment. When evening came, Colin finally saw a huge army camp with Golden Lion flags fluttering in the wind. The main generals of the Golden Lion Legion who had received the news had already lined up outside the camp to welcome Colin's group. On the way here, Scholar Dwayne gave Colin a brief introduction of the higher-ups of the Golden Lion Legion. Knight Nelson, commander of the Legion, and his two deputies, Knight Lewis and Knight Campbell. Of course, as an army under the direct command of the House of St. Hilda, the so-called Legion commander of the Golden Lion Legion was actually just a title. The one who truly controlled this army was the Duke of St. Hilda himself. Of course, if it was the first successor of the Duke, such as Marquis Charles, he would also have the qualifications to lead this army in battle. However, now that the Duke of St. Hilda was dead and the position of Marquis of the Northern Frontier was vacant, it was debatable who the Golden Lion Legion should listen to. At this moment, the attitude of Knight Narson was of utmost importance. Knight Nelson was a middle-aged man with a dignified demeanor. He was over 2 meters tall and had a muscular build, giving him an imposing aura. Knight Lewis was slightly older. His sideburns were graying, and he always had a kind smile on his face. When he spoke, it was as if he was bathing in the spring breeze. Knight Cambonine, on the other hand, had a cold temperament and was taciturn. He also had a hideous scar on his face, which made him seem difficult to get along with. The fact that these three knights were able to lead the Golden Lion Legion meant that they were deeply trusted by the Duke of St. Hilda. Their loyalty shouldn't be a problem. After some small talk, Knight Nelson led Colin and the others into the barracks. The last elite force of the House of St. Hilda was gathered here. The neat rows of soldiers and horses, as well as the endless military tents, gave people a sense of security. The 80,000-strong army was in good order. From this, it could be seen that Knight Nelson had excellent leadership skills. After entering the temporary command post, Knight Nelson went straight to the point and asked, "Miss Vera, Viscount Angley, I have heard the news of the Duke's death. Is it true?" "It's true. Vera nodded with a sorrowful expression. She then told Knight Nelson about the events that happened on the day of the wedding, as well as some of her speculations about the murderer. Knight Nelson listened quietly, and the atmosphere in the barracks was filled with sadness and anger. After the three commanders of the Golden Lion Legion digested the news, Colin coughed softly and said, "Everyone, please accept the news. I know that the death of the Duke is hard for you to accept and that you want to take revenge as soon as possible. However, the enemy is strong now. The Menham family's army has entered the northern frontier and will soon appear behind the Golden Lion Legion. Therefore, I suggest that we retreat to Winter City and avoid the enemy for the time being before we make further plans." Colin's words did not cause much of an uproar. Knight Nelson's head was still lowered, and no one knew what he was thinking. Obviously, even though he had married Vera, Colin was still not qualified to mobilize this army. "I also think that we should retreat. We cannot let the last elite force of the House of St. Hilda die at the Rapids River." Vera also agreed. However, Knight Nelson still did not say anything. The atmosphere in the barracks gradually became awkward. At this time, Knight Lewis smiled and said, "Viscount Angley, I know that you are sincerely planning for the Golden Lion Legion, but we are under the orders of the Duke to stop the Dawson family. If we retreat, the Dawson family will take the opportunity to cross the Rapids River and invade the territory of the House of St. Hilda. Who will bear the responsibility for this?" Colin shook his head and retorted, "But if you are trapped here and wait for the Menham clan to cut off the army's escape route, then attack from both sides with the Dawson clan. The Golden Lion Legion might not be able to escape defeat." Knight Lewis wanted to say something, but when he saw Knight Nelson slowly stand up, he decisively closed his mouth and threw the problem to the other party. Knight Nelson's eyes swept across Colin's face and finally stopped at Vera. He then asked, "Miss Vera, where is the Duke's body now?" "It is just outside. Can we pay our respects to the Duke's remains?" "Of course." Vera then looked at Colin. Colin nodded at Knight Roger and motioned for him to bring the Duke of St. Hilda's coffin. Knight Roger took the order and left. Once again, the barracks fell into an awkward silence. Colin and Scholar Dwayne looked at each other and saw the dignified look in each other's eyes. The high-ranking officers of the Golden Lion Legion were more stubborn than they had imagined. However, such stubbornness was somewhat baffling to Colin. Even if Knight Nelson felt that Colin and Vera were not qualified to give orders to the Golden Lion Legion, under the current circumstances, if the Golden Lion Legion did not want to be attacked from both sides, the best choice was to retreat to Cold Winter City. Colin did not understand why Knight Nelson and the others were so resistant to this suggestion. Soon, Knight Roger pushed the Duke of St. Hilda's coffin into the barracks. Everyone immediately surrounded the coffin and prepared to pay their respects. With a click, the lid of the coffin slowly opened. Colin placed his left hand on his chest and bowed his head. His face was perfectly painted with a sad expression. However, he immediately heard Knight Nelson's questioning voice. "Viscount Angley, are you sure this is the Duke's body?" Colin raised his head with a puzzled expression. He looked at the coffin and explained, "That's right." He explained, "Knight Nelson, the Duke was petrified by an unknown forbidden spell. Therefore, his body might look a little." Before he could finish his sentence, Colin was stunned. This was because he saw a stone statue of the Duke of St. Hilda lying in the coffin. It was not the petrified Duke of St. Hilda. The two statues looked the same, but they were actually worlds apart. Whether it was the details of the statue or the feeling it gave off, Colin was certain that it was not the Duke of St. Hilda's body. It was just an ordinary statue of the Duke. It had been swapped. Colin was shocked, and he turned his head to meet Scholar Dwayne's shocked gaze. Both of them exchanged glances, and the same thought flashed through their minds. The Morrison family. Chapter 241. Looking at the stone sculpture in the coffin, Colin's mind flashed with thousands of thoughts for a moment. Along the way, only the Morrison family was able to secretly swap the Duke's body with the Duke's body. After all, they had only stayed in Floral City for a night and even opened the coffin for the Morrison family to pay their respects. Who would have thought that they would actually want to steal the Duke's body? What were they trying to do? Colin naturally thought of the blood pool under the clock tower of Phoenix Butterfly Castle. He had a hunch that the reason why the Morrison family wanted to steal the Duke's body was related to the mysterious blood pool. It looks a bit like a stone sculpture, but this is indeed the Duke's body, Colin said firmly. He had to be tough now. It was not a big problem that the Duke of St. Hilda's body had been swapped, but if Knight Nelson found out about it and refused to acknowledge the Duke's death, then it would be troublesome. They could even claim that the Duke of St. Hilda was missing. Death and missing were two completely different concepts. Once the Duke died, then the command of the Golden Lion Legion would naturally fall into the hands of his successor. However, if they could not confirm the Duke of St. Hilda's death, then without receiving the Duke's orders, Knight Nelson and the others could completely ignore the orders of others and independently control the most elite military force of the House of St. Hilda. Knight Lewis squinted his eyes and carefully looked at the body in the coffin for a long time before he smiled and shook his head. I'm sorry, Viscount Angley, I'm not questioning your integrity, but this is obviously just an ordinary stone sculpture. Vera also saw that there was something wrong with the body at this time, but when she saw that Colin insisted that it was the Duke's body, she remained silent. Scholar Dwayne of course saw that something was wrong, and he also realized that things were developing in an unpredictable direction, so he quickly said, Knight Nelson, Knight Lewis, Knight Campbell, the Duke was petrified to death by an unknown forbidden spell at Viscount Angley's wedding. This happened in front of everyone's eyes. If you have any questions, you can ask the nobles present at the wedding. I believe they will give you a definite answer. Scholar Dwayne's words were a little tricky. He did not directly say that the body in the coffin was the Duke's. Instead, he wanted to use the witnesses at the wedding to confirm the Duke's death. However, Knight Narson remained unmoved. As for what happened on the night of Viscount Angley's wedding, we will naturally send someone to verify it. But before that, please forgive us for not disobeying the orders of the Grand Duke and withdrawing to chilly winter. Colin's suspicions grew stronger and stronger. Narson and the others' attitudes were too strange. Even if he was wary of Colin seizing power, he should have waited until they were safely back to chilly winter. Otherwise, if the Golden Lion Legion was surrounded by the Menham and Dawson families, what was the point of fighting for command? Of course you can take your time to verify the Duke's death, Colin advised in a low voice. But now, withdrawing to chilly winter is an urgent matter. This is the only way to protect the Golden Lion Legion. Even if the Duke comes back to life, he will give the same order. Knight Narson chuckled and shook his head. Not necessarily. What do you mean? Colin asked with a frown. Knight Lewis laughed at the same time and explained, Lord Viscounts, you may not know this, but we already have strong reinforcements. Even if the Menham and Dawson families come together, the victor will only be determined after a battle. Strong reinforcements? Colin suddenly had a bad premonition. Scholar Dwayne's eyes flashed as though he had thought of a possibility. That's right. Knight Narson nodded. Just a few days ago, Earl Amon led his army and surrendered to us. So, with the addition of the Oman family's army, we may be able to fight a decisive battle with the dwarves. Earl Oman? Colin narrowed his eyes, which flashed with a dangerous light. You actually believe the words of a northern frontier trader? What if he's faking his surrender? Impossible, Knight Narson said confidently. We received news that Fallen Eagle City has been burned to ruins by the St. Thean family. With such a deep grudge, I don't believe that Earl Amon is willing to continue following the St. Thean family. Knight Lewis immediately added, furthermore, Earl Ullman also brought two heads, Lawrence and Penny. If you know anything about the House of St. Thean, you will know that one of them is Mr. Ullman's son, and the other is his sister. Viscount Angley, tell me, under such circumstances, is it possible for the Oman family and the St. Thean family to make peace? Colin was silent. This was the first time he knew that Lawrence was Mr. Amon's son, but seeing how Earl Amon had cut off his head to surrender, it was probably true. This meant that Earl Amon had really fallen out with the St. Thean family. This kind of blood feud had already exceeded the scope of a trick of self-injury. It was not something that could be resolved with simple trust. If Zhou Yu burned down Huang Gai's home, and Huang Gai killed Zhou Yu's son and sister, then even if the two had agreed on a fake act, they would suspect that the other party would really do it. Moreover, Lawrence and Penny were the only ties between the St. Thean family and the Oman family. Now that they had been killed, what reason did Mr. Oman have to believe that Earl Oman would stand on his side? But what puzzled Colin was, why would the meticulous Mr. Oman allow Earl Oman to kill Lawrence and Penny, and even lead the Oman family's army to the house of St. Hilda? Since Mr. Burr had already planned to sacrifice Fallen Eagle City, he should have guessed that Earl Oman would break off relations with the house of St. Thean. Could it be that he did not make preparations in advance? At the very least, he should not have allowed Earl Oman to switch sides and strengthen the enemy. At this moment, footsteps could be heard outside the tent. Following which, Count Oman quickly walked in. "I heard that His Excellency the Duke was murdered. Is that true?" Earl Oman asked anxiously as soon as he entered. Then he saw the coffin in the middle of the tent. Suddenly, Earl Oman froze on the spot, as if he had been struck by lightning. It was as if he could not accept the news of the Duke of St. Hilda's death. Colin rolled his eyes at the sight of this. Forcing it was too awkward. "Your Grace." Earl Oman rushed to the side of the coffin, but when he saw the Duke's body, he was stunned. This is the Duke's body? Is there a mistake? This is clearly an ordinary stone sculpture. Colin was getting more and more frustrated. The pit that the Morrison family had dug for him could no longer be filled. Thus, he ignored Earl Oman's question. Instead, he looked straight into Knight Nelson's eyes and asked in a low voice, "Knight Nelson, does this mean that you have decided to fight to the death with the dwarves here?" "Yes," Knight Nelson nodded and said concisely. He was firm and resolute. Then, Colin turned to look at Knight Lewis. Knight Lewis lowered his head and avoided Colin's gaze. It seemed like he had decided to support Nelson's decision. Colin glanced at Knight Canbenine. Only then did he realize that this knight had not expressed any opinion. Although Knight Canbenine had always been a man of few words, how could he not say anything when it came to such an important decision? Seeing Colin's gaze, Knight Canbenine stared straight into Colin's eyes, as if trying to convey some sort of message. "All right." Colin suddenly smiled. "Then I wish you, Knight Nelson, a great victory over the dwarves. Bring order and peace to the northern frontier." "Thank you, Lord Viscounts. If you can lead the Angeli family's army to advance and retreat with us." Then, without waiting for Knight Nelson to finish speaking, Colin immediately interrupted him. "I still need to escort the Duke's body back to Coldwinter City. It's getting late, so I'll stay here for the night. We'll set off tomorrow morning. As for Rapid Flow River, I'll leave it to you and Earl Oman." After saying that, he motioned for Roger to push the coffin out, and at the same time, he pulled Vera and walked outside. The three knights and the Earl looked at each other in dismay. Chapter 242. The dim candlelight and the open coffin made the atmosphere in the tent a little gloomy. Colin, Vera, and Scholar Dwayne surrounded the coffin with a dignified expression on their faces. "This is indeed not my father's body," Vera said with certainty. "There is no arcane fluctuation on it at all. It is just an ordinary stone sculpture. If it is really a petrified body, it is impossible for such a situation to occur." Colin slammed his palm on the coffin lid and said angrily, "It must be the Morrison family's doing." Vera frowned and asked doubtfully, "But why would the Morrison family do this? What is the use of stealing my father's body?" Colin hesitated for a moment, but in the end, he did not tell Vera what he had seen in the underground cave of the Butterfly Castle. After all, it was related to his biggest secret. Even if she was his wife, Colin was not willing to be honest with her. At least not now. "I suspect that the Morrison family has a secret relationship with Knight Nelson and the others," Scholar Dwayne said. "Huh." Colin was slightly surprised and quickly asked, "Why do you say that?" Scholar Dwayne said unhurriedly, "Lord Viscount, did you notice that when Knight Narson said that he wanted to pay his respects to the Duke's remains, it was right after you suggested that we retreat to Coldwinter? It is as if he already knew that as long as we open the coffin, we will see a body that has been replaced. This will make it impossible for us to completely confirm the death of the Duke. In this way, Knight Nelson and the others will have a reason to reject Miss Vera's suggestion." Colin nodded with a dignified expression. He found that Scholar Dwayne's words were indeed quite reasonable. In retrospect, the actions of Knight Nelson and the others did indeed seem to indicate that they knew in advance that there was a fake body placed in the coffin. So, why did the Morrison family and Knight Nelson do this? When he heard Colin's question, Scholar Dwayne rubbed his chin and thought for a moment before replying. I think there are two motives for them to do this. Firstly, it was the Oman family's surrender that had boosted Nelson's confidence. That was why he wanted to have a showdown with the dwarves. If that's the case, I'm afraid that Count Oman is also involved in this conspiracy. Hearing this, Colin could not help but nod. He recalled Earl Almond's pretentious behavior when he saw the coffin, as if he had already known that the Duke's body was fake. Secondly, Scholar Dwayne continued, if Knight Narsen and Count Oman really defeat the dwarves, they will become the true heroes of the northern frontier. When the time came, he might even have to ask for their opinions on who would become the Dukes of the North. It was foreseeable that they would elect young Master Joyce as the leader of the northern frontier. After all, a child like Joyce is much easier to control, unlike Miss Vera who has her own opinions and is married to a powerful feudal lord. Hee. Colin suddenly laughed. He did not know if it was because of Scholar Dwayne's flattery, or because he was laughing at Knight Narsen and the others for overestimating themselves. He had to admit that Scholar Dwayne had given a very good analysis of the situation. Originally, Colin had thought that the Morrison family had stolen the Duke's body because they wanted to conduct some secret research. But now, he felt that perhaps the other party's purpose was not as simple as it seemed. Moreover, the Morrison family was not the only force behind this conspiracy. At the very least, Count Oman was most likely involved. This guy had a grudge against Colin, and he definitely did not want to see Vera successfully become the leader of the Dukes of the North. Therefore, he would definitely find a way to prevent the Golden Lion Legion from falling into Vera's hands. Count Morrison is actually so ambitious. Then he can forget about marrying Cousin Nina. Looking at Vera's angry expression, Colin was suddenly amused. He did not expect her to be thinking about this at this time. Her brain circuit was really strange and cute. After patting Vera's head, Colin turned to look at Scholar Dwayne. Seeing that he still had a calm expression on his face, Colin asked, Scholar Dwayne, when you persuaded me to come here, did you not think about the possibility that Knight Narsen would not listen to your orders? Of course I thought about it. Scholar Dwayne had a confident look on his face. I did have a backup plan. Oh? Please tell me. Colin's face was full of joy as he quickly asked. Scholar Dwayne looked at Colin and said leisurely, Sir Viscounts, the backup plan that I mentioned is actually related to one person. I think you should have already noticed who that person is. Colin rolled his eyes and immediately thought of one of the 3 senior commanders of the Golden Lion Legion, Knight Campbell, who had been silent all this time. Before leaving, Colin had exchanged glances with the other party. Obviously, Knight Campbell had something to say to Colin. Are you talking about Knight Campbell? That's right. Scholar Dwayne snapped his fingers and explained, in fact, when the Duke appointed the commander of the Golden Lion Legion, he already had a plan in mind. You should also be able to see that Knight Campbell is obviously not on good terms with Knight Narsen and Knight Lewis. No, it is not as simple as that. Actually, Knight Cambanine and Knight Narsen did have a grudge against each other. That was a matter of the past, but the Duke still forced Knight Cambanine into Narsen's Golden Lion Legion and even made him one of his deputies. He didn't want the upper echelons of the Golden Lion Legion to be as united as an iron plate. In this way, Knight Campbell has become an eye that cannot be bribed, and he will keep an eye on Knight Narsen on behalf of the Duke. If something happens to Knight Narsen, then, Colin decisively continued, then Knight Cambanine is the candidate for Legion Commander. Scholar Dwayne nodded slowly and smiled, revealing his white teeth. Under the dim candlelight, he looked a little ferocious. Upon hearing this, Vera finally reacted. Her eyes widened in surprise and she deliberately lowered her voice. Are you planning to kill Knight Narsen? Colin's eyes flashed and he comforted her. We don't have to kill Knight Narsen. As long as we take back the command of the Golden Lion Legion from him, everything will be fine. As for Count Oman, he will definitely die. But, But didn't Count Oman already surrender? Vera was obviously still fantasizing about Count Oman and Knight Narsen. Can't we just let Count Oman and Knight Narsen fight against the dwarves? If they win, then won't the rebellion at the northern frontier be completely quelled? Colin shook his head firmly. You are too naive. Even if they can defeat the dwarves, after they win, the first thing they will have to deal with is the Angeli family. Of course, they will also have to deal with you. Only then will they be able to clear the way for Joyce to take over. Moreover, the Golden Lion Legion is the House of St. Hilda's last bargaining chip. Why should they hand it over to someone else? If they lose this bet, then Winter City will definitely fall. When that happens, the Lord of the Northern Frontier will have to change his surname. Under such circumstances, the safest choice is to retreat to Winter City with the army. We cannot let Knight Narsen lead the Golden Lion Legion into the abyss for his own selfish reasons. Vera nodded silently, but she still could not bring herself to do it. What about Count Amon? Since he has already turned over to us, then there is no need to kill him, right? Colin had no choice but to speak again. Do you still remember when I ran away from home alone and met you at the Mirror Lake camp? Of course I remember. Vera nodded, but she was a little puzzled as to why Colin would bring this up at this time. Do you know why I ran away from home alone? Why? Colin's face was gloomy as he said fiercely, because I was assassinated in my bedroom in the castle. It was an assassination by a knight of the Angeli family. What? Vera was shocked and quickly asked, who was the mastermind? Count Amon. Colin blurted out, I only found out later that my father died at the front line. So, if I had been killed, then the Angeli family's title would have fallen to my sister, Caitlin, and Caitlin, married to Vala Oman. Vera suddenly realized and immediately said with hatred, Count Oman actually dared to assassinate a noble. This is a disgrace to all knights. He should be killed. Yes, he should be killed. Colin's smile returned to his face. So, we must not let Count Amon and Knight Narsen's conspiracy succeed, even if we have to resort to the most extreme means. Vera nodded heavily. She no longer felt guilty about killing an ally. When Scholar Dwayne saw that the young couple had finally reached an agreement, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Lord Viscounts, it will not be easy to seize the command of the Golden Lion Legion from Knight Narsen. We will have to think about it carefully. However, Colin smiled confidently and said, You're right. You don't have to worry about that. I already have a plan. Chapter 243. The night was dark and everything was quiet. A figure clad in full armor was striding towards Knight Nelson's tent. Halt. Or you. Identify yourself. In front of the tent, Knight Narsen's personal guards immediately stopped the unknown armored figure. The armored man calmly took off his helmet. Lord Charles. As a direct subordinate of the House of St. Hilda, it was impossible for them not to recognize Charles. However, the personal guards couldn't believe their eyes. They had heard that the eldest son of the Duke of St. Hilda had died in the Troll Empire. How could he appear here? Charles glanced at the shocked guards with an expressionless face and then walked towards the tent. The personal guards didn't dare to stop him. In the tent, Knight Narsen heard the commotion outside. Just as he was wondering why the personal guards let someone in without informing him, he saw Charles's familiar face appear in front of him. Lord Charles, Knight Narsen was also completely dumbfounded. He was clearly shocked by Charles's resurrection. Didn't you? Those were rumors that I asked Viscount Angley to spread. Charles spoke, but his tone was strange. It was as though he couldn't speak properly after not speaking for a long time. What's wrong with your throat? Cough, cough. My throat was injured. Colin was helpless. Even though he could control the blood thrall to speak, it took a lot of effort to do so. Moreover, his tone was very strange. Fortunately, Knight Narsen's attention wasn't on this. After hearing Charles's explanation, he didn't harp on it and hurriedly bowed. Although Charles had been stripped of his title, he had represented the Duke of St. Hilda in the Golden Lion Legion for a period of time. Therefore, Knight Narsen could be considered his old subordinate. I need you to immediately lead the army back to chilly winter, Charles said in a commanding tone. Knight Nelson's expression froze, and he slowly raised his head, the respect on his face gradually disappearing. "Lord Charles, I don't know what Viscount Angley told you. Now, we have a chance to fight to the death with the dwarves. Why are we retreating to Winter Castle? Are you sure you can win?" Charles asked expressionlessly. Knight Narsen shook his head and said, "The situation on the battlefield is ever-changing. Who dares to say that victory is certain?" Charles's lips curled into a stiff sneer. "Then if you lose, can you bear the responsibility?" "If I lose, I will atone for my sins with my death," Knight Narsen replied firmly. If the Golden Lion Legion dies in this battle, the northern frontier will fall into the hands of the House of St. Theon. Even if you die 1,000 times, you won't be able to atone for your sins." Knight Narsen was silent for a moment, but the look in his eyes became more and more resolute. He shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, Sir Charles. The order I received from the Lord Duke was to defend the Riverrun River to the death and not allow the Dawson clan's army to take even half a step forward. Father is already dead. Before seeing the Lord Duke's body with my own eyes, please forgive me for not acknowledging his death." At this point, Colin realized that there was no way to persuade Knight Narsen. Since he couldn't persuade him with words, he would have to use another method. The air in the tent gradually froze. Charles spoke in a cold voice. "Narsen, are you determined to fight me to the end?" "My apologies, Lord Charles." Knight Narsen lowered his head in apology, but he refused to budge. Asterisk clang. Asterisk the next second, a cold glint flashed. Knight Narsen's heart skipped a beat. He hurriedly leaned back, narrowly avoiding Charles's fatal strike. "Lord Charles, what are you doing?" Knight Narsen clearly didn't expect Charles to kill him without a word. "I'm going to kill you, you traitor of the House of St. Hilda." Charles roared as he drew closer with his sword. Seeing the killing intent on Charles's face, Knight Narsen didn't dare to be careless. He immediately drew his sword from his waist and stabbed towards Charles's chest. Knight Narsen's intention was to force Charles to retreat, but he didn't expect Charles to ignore it and continue to charge forward. By the time Knight Narsen realized that something was wrong and prepared to change his move, it was already too late. "Lord Charles, retreat." Charles completely ignored Knight Narsen's warning and impatiently charged towards the cold glint of the sword. Asterisk G. Asterisk the long sword pierced through Charles's chest. At the same time, Charles's long sword struck Narsen's shoulder, almost severing his right arm. However, Knight Narsen didn't have the heart to care about his injuries. He looked at Charles, who was so close to him, in a daze. My lord." The guards who heard the commotion and came to investigate appeared in the tent. When they saw the scene in front of them, they were also stunned. Knight Narsen killed Charles St. Hilda? Blood flowed out of Charles's mouth like a fountain, but a strange smile appeared on his face. "What happened?" Knight Cambonen's voice came from outside the tent. Hearing this voice, Knight Narsen painfully closed his eyes. He knew that he was done for. "What happened?" Count Alman walked out of the tent and looked at the noisy scene in the distance. He asked in confusion. The guards also shook their heads in confusion. "Go take a look." "Yes." A personal guard immediately obeyed the order and ran towards Knight Narsen's tent. Count Alman was about to go back and wait for news when he saw a figure in full armor walking towards him. "Halt! Who is it?" The guards immediately went forward to stop her. The armored person decisively took off her helmet, revealing a beautiful face. "Cynthia Sudo?" Earl Oman recognized his niece at a glance. "You've been gone for so long. Where have you been?" "Uncle, I've been hiding in Icestone City. I finally found a big secret of the Angeli family." "What secret?" Count Alman felt that Cynthia's tone was strange, but when he heard the word secret, his attention was immediately drawn. "I discovered that the reason Viscount Angley's strength could increase so quickly was because..." Cynthia spoke as she approached Count Alman. When the two were less than 3 steps apart, she suddenly charged forward. A cold light flashed in her hand. It was a dagger. Asterisk teeth. Asterisk the dagger stabbed into Count Alman's abdomen, but a large hand held it tightly, preventing it from going any deeper. "Why did you betray me?" Count Almond's face was terrifyingly dark as he looked into Cynthia's eyes. However, he did not see any guilt or hesitation in her eyes. There was only a deep and silent coldness, like a beast that had died a long time ago. Asterisk bang bang bang. Asterisk just as Count Almond was shocked by Cynthia's gaze, a series of earth-shattering footsteps came from behind him. A large armored person charged over like a giant elephant. His personal guards immediately drew their swords to stop him, but they were easily swatted away like flies. Count Almond immediately realized that this was a trap for him. He immediately roared and kicked Cynthia, who was in front of him, away. He turned around and punched out. The golden holy light spread forward like flowing water, forming a solid barrier in front of him. Asterisk rumble. Asterisk the golden barrier shattered in an instant, and Count Almond could only feel his arms creaking under the weight. The wound on his abdomen instantly tore open, and the heart-wrenching pain almost made him lose his footing. Asterisk poo. Asterisk Count Almond could not help but spit out a mouthful of blood, and his body was sent flying by the terrifying impact. As soon as he landed, he ran back without hesitation, shouting at the same time, "I'm sorry, assassin." This shout was like a spark falling into dry wood, igniting the entire camp. Countless soldiers of the Almond family raised their weapons and charged over, wanting to protect their count. Seeing that the situation was bad, the armored person and Cynthia did not waste any more time and immediately turned to run. Soon, they disappeared into the darkness of the night. Chapter 244. The piercing sound of the bugle echoed throughout the Golden Lion Legion's camp. The soldiers who had just woken up from their sleep rushed out of their tents in a mess. While randomly putting on the armor, he was also looking for his own weapon. Curses, shouts, and the screams of soldiers colliding with each other in the darkness were intertwined together. "Stay where you are. Don't run around. Anyone who disobeys will be executed." The officers ran around the camp, shouting and maintaining order. In fact, the current situation was very dangerous. If they were not careful, there would be chaos in the camp. Even if there was no enemy invasion at all, under the spread of panic and in the middle of the night, it was easy for the officers to lose control of the soldiers, leading to the soldiers who were unaware of the situation to kill each other. Fortunately, Colin had made preparations in advance. He had sent the Black Knights to patrol the Golden Lion Legion's camp. If anyone was found to be trying to cause trouble, they would be immediately arrested and severely punished. However, the Oman family's camp was in chaos. In the middle of the night, military orders were not transmitted smoothly. The soldiers did not know what was going on. Moreover, these soldiers were already immersed in the anger and grief of fallen Eagle City's destruction. They were on the verge of a mental breakdown, and they were only able to hold on because Count Oman had vowed to avenge them. However, in the midst of this chaos, the suppressed anger in the hearts of the soldiers exploded and turned into a hysterical frenzy. Many of the soldiers did not care and cut down anyone they saw. When they were done, they realized that they were not enemies, but their own comrades. This kind of madness spread and became completely uncontrollable. Count Oman was also injured at this time. He was still wondering why his niece, Cynthia, had betrayed him and who was the one who had plotted to assassinate him. He did not stand up in time to calm the people down. By the time he realized that something was wrong, the situation in the camp had already gone out of control. "Brother Charles." In Knight Nelson's tent, Vera cried as she threw herself onto Charles's body. She never thought that her brother would come back from the dead and then die again. "Nelson, how dare you murder Sir Charles?" Colin scolded righteously. At present, Knight Nelson had already been restrained by Knight Cambanine. His eyes were lifeless as he sat on the ground. When he heard Colin's question, the corners of his mouth curled into an ugly, bitter smile. "Would you believe me if I said that I didn't want to kill him at all and that he ran into the tip of my sword on his own accord?" It was clear that everyone was looking at Knight Narson as if he was an idiot after hearing his explanation. Knight Narson also understood that there was no way he could explain himself in this situation. The strangeness of the whole thing was beyond his comprehension. Scholar Dawn's eyes flickered, and no one knew what he was thinking. When Colin told him that there was a way to deal with Knight Nelson, he never thought that the situation would turn out like this. Even though he couldn't figure out what went wrong for Knight Nelson to accidentally kill Charles, the end result was still pretty good. Nelson was done. The Golden Lion Legion was under the direct command of the House of St. Hilda. Regardless of whether it was a mid-level officer or a low-level soldier, their loyalty to the House of St. Hilda was definitely the highest in the northern frontier. Knight Nelson had actually killed the eldest son of the House of St. Hilda. This kind of evil deed meant that he had completely lost his appeal in this army. At this time, many of the soldiers of the Golden Lion Legion hated him to the bone and were looking for an opportunity to kill him to avenge Charles. At this time, the turmoil in the Oman family's camp was getting more and more serious. Screams and sounds of slaughter could even be heard here. Colin frowned as he listened for a while. Puzzled, he asked, "What's going on?" The assassination attempt on Earl Oman had failed, which made Colin rather disappointed. Count Oman was too vigilant. Even Cynthia couldn't succeed in a sneak attack. Moreover, this person's strength was indeed formidable. He was actually able to escape from the hands of the 5th-rank warrior, Prince Malvi. But after the assassination attempt failed, the blood thralls had already retreated. Why was it getting more and more chaotic over there? Scholar Dwayne listened for a while and judged, there should be a whistle in the camps. A whistle in the camp? Colin immediately trembled. He had heard of the terror of a whistle in the camp. If it wasn't handled well, the casualties caused by a whistle in the camp would be no less than a crushing defeat. Thus, Colin immediately ordered, "Knight Lewis, please immediately go and maintain order. Don't let the panic of the Oman family's army spread to the Golden Lion Legion. Remember, your mission is to guard the Golden Lion Legion's camp. If Count Oman asks for help, you must not send any troops. If any of the soldiers rush into our camp, please don't be lenient. Kill them all without mercy." Knight Lewis hesitated for a moment, but under Colin's aggressive gaze, he nodded and said, "Yes." At this time, he understood the situation clearly. Knight Nelson was completely finished. Obviously, Knight Campbell would take over the position of Legion Commander, and the Golden Lion Legion would be controlled by Colin and Vera. Under such circumstances, Knight Lewis had to make a choice. And his choice was not unexpected. After Knight Lewis left the tent, Knight Nelson finally raised his head and stared at Colin. His eyes seemed to have regained some of their vitality. The knight, who was at the end of his rope, said in a deep voice, "Viscount Angley, do you still insist on withdrawing the Golden Lion Legion to Coldwinter City?" Knight Nelson nodded when he heard this, as if he had finally accepted reality. He said frankly, "Did you know? Before you arrived here, I received a mysterious letter. The letter said that the Duke is not dead and asked me to carefully examine the Duke's body." Colin's expression changed and he quickly asked, "Who sent the letter to you?" Knight Nelson slowly shook his head. There was no signature on the letter. Colin frowned. Just as he was about to ask again, Knight Nelson said, "Sir Viscounts, can you tell me if the Duke is really dead?" Colin nodded solemnly. "I can swear on the honor of the ancestors of the Angeli family that the Duke has unfortunately passed away." Knight Nelson nodded as if he had finally let go of something. He turned to look at Vera and bowed before saying, "Miss Vera, please believe me. My loyalty to the House of St. Hilda has never changed." After saying this sentence, Knight Nelson did not wait for Vera to reply. He stood up abruptly and rushed to the back. Knight Campbell was holding his sword against Knight Nelson's back, and he was caught off guard when he realized that his sword had already pierced through Knight Nelson's chest. Knight Nelson turned to his old rival with a cruel smile on his face. "Canbenin, you've been dreaming of this day for a long time, haven't you?" After that, he turned around again and said to everyone in front of him, "Whether you believe it or not, Charles died like this." Knight Campbell pulled out his sword and Knight Nelson slowly fell to the ground. Soon he was no longer breathing. Blood flowed in the tent and the atmosphere was almost stagnant. After a while, Colin opened his mouth and broke the suffocating silence. "Since Knight Nelson has committed suicide, the most important thing right now is to choose a new commander. Vera, as the only St. Hilda here, Who do you think is the most suitable person to take on this responsibility? Although Vera felt sorry for her brother, she knew that she needed to pull herself together at this time. As soon as she heard Knight Campbell's words, she wiped the tears off her face and looked around. Finally, she said softly, "Knight Campbell, please be in charge of the Golden Lion Legion." Knight Campbell immediately knelt down on one knee and replied loudly. On the other side of the Rapids River, a group of dwarven cavalry was looking at the Oman family's camp. "What's going on over there?" Marquis Dawson had a very dignified expression on his face. "My lord, a scout reported this morning that a group of black cavalry soldiers had crossed the Rapids River and entered the Golden Lion Legion's camp. I think that Viscount Angley and Earl Amon must have had a conflict." Marquis Dawson stroked his beard and thought for a moment before he finally gave an order. "Tell the soldiers to get ready. As soon as the sky turns bright, we will cross the river immediately." "Yes." Chapter 245. The light of dawn dispelled the darkness and dispelled the fear that enveloped the hearts of the people. The chaos in the Oman family's camp finally subsided. However, when Colin sent out a messenger to search for Count Amon, he was nowhere to be found. "What? He ran away?" "Yes, Lord Viscounts. Not only Count Amon, but the Oman family's army is also moving towards the south." Colin sneered. This Count Oman must have been born in the year of the rabbit. How could he run so fast? However, from this, it could be seen that Count Amon was indeed extremely vigilant, and had fled very decisively. Last night's assassination, the other party probably guessed that Colin was the one who ordered it. However, how could Colin let this enemy off so easily? He immediately ordered, "Knight Cambanine, please immediately mobilize the army and chase after Count Amon." Cambanine could tell that Vera completely followed her husband's orders. Therefore, Colin was now the true commander of this army. But before Knight Cambanine could leave the tent with his orders, he saw a messenger hurrying over and reporting. "My lord, there are strange movements from the enemy on the other side of the Rapids River. I'm afraid they are planning to cross the river." "What?" Colin was shocked and quickly said to Cambanine, "Don't worry about Count Amon for now. Gather the soldiers and prepare to fight the Dawson family." When Colin and the others arrived at the rapids, they saw more than a dozen strange-looking boats connected by iron chains, coming down the river from upstream. The surface of the ship was very wide, and the draft was very deep. It seemed that a very heavy object was used as the ballast. The roof of the ship was raised high, forming a triangle on the deck of the ship. When these ships were connected together, it was as if a wide corridor had been added to the river. Colin immediately saw that the enemy was preparing to build a pontoon bridge. He immediately ordered the archers to shoot arrows into the river. Whoosh, 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 the Golden Lion Legion stood on the south bank of the Rapids River and continuously shot arrows into the river. However, the effect was not ideal. The arrows were all blocked by the thick canopy and did not cause much damage. At this time, the dwarven ships had also arrived at the predetermined position. They dropped their anchors and threw out two thick iron chains. The soldiers who had been waiting on the other side immediately rushed up and nailed one end of the iron chain to the ground. However, this only secured one end of the pontoon bridge. The south end had yet to be secured. At this time, the pontoon bridge was like a headless snake. One end was fixed to the north bank, while the other end was still a short distance away from the south bank. It was constantly swaying with the flow of the water. Just as Colin was wondering if the other party had miscalculated the width of the river and caused the pontoon bridge to be shorter, another large boat floated down from upstream. The ship was full of armored dwarven infantrymen with huge shields in their hands. At this moment, Colin realized that this large ship could fill the gap between the pontoon bridge and the south bank. Clearly, the giant shield infantry on this ship should be the vanguard of the crossing. Crack, crack. The large ship gradually moved into position, and the pontoon bridge was officially formed. Colin was dumbfounded. Clearly, he did not expect the dwarven craftsmen to have reached such a level. However, the dwarves were indeed talented in forging, construction, and civil engineering. At this moment, the pontoon bridge was already formed. It was not possible for the Golden Lion Legion to cause large-scale casualties to the dwarves on the river. However, the real difficulty of crossing the river was how to gain a foothold on the opposite shore. Therefore, the decisive moment of this battle had not yet arrived. However, the smooth progress of the early preparations had greatly boosted the morale of the dwarven soldiers. Deafening cheers could be heard from the northern shore of the Rapids River. Marquis Dawson looked at the pontoon bridge on the river and revealed a satisfied smile. He felt that he had already grasped the corner of the Goddess of Victory's clothes. As long as he continued to hold on, he would be able to kiss her. Marquis Dawson smugly waved his hand and ordered, "Beat the drums. Cross the river." Dong dong dong. The war drums rumbled, announcing the official opening of the Battle of the River Crossing. A general's flag slowly moved forward, and the dwarven officers roared boorishly. Squads of dwarven soldiers wielded swords, spears, and shields as they walked onto the pontoon bridge and rapidly advanced to the southern shore. Next, it was the bloodiest and cruelest battle to land on the shore. At this moment, the archers of the Golden Lion Legion had already stopped shooting and rapidly retreated. Thousands of infantrymen obeyed the order and moved forward in formation on the riverbank. It looked like they were going to defend the riverbank to the death. To be honest, this battle was not within Colin's plan. He and Scholar Dwayne wanted to bring the Golden Lion Legion back to chilly winter and defend the tall and sturdy city walls. However, plans could not keep up with changes. The enemy would not just stand there foolishly and wait for them to attack. The previous night's whistle had caused Marquis Dawson to think that there was a problem with the Golden Lion Legion, so he wanted to take the opportunity to cross the river. Under such circumstances, Colin could not lead the army to retreat. After all, the dwarves had prepared overnight and completed the pontoon bridge early in the morning. They were already crossing the river. If the Golden Lion Legion still wanted to retreat, Marquis Dawson would definitely chase after them. When that happened, the retreat would most likely turn into a complete retreat. Moreover, Count Amon, who had escaped, was also an uncertain factor. Colin still did not know how many soldiers Count Allman could gather after last night's battle. He also did not know if Count Allman would stop the Golden Lion army midway after this incident. Hence, under such circumstances, Colin had to deal with Marquis Dawson, who was attempting to cross the river, so that he would not dare to chase after them. Only then could the Golden Lion Legion retreat with ease. At this moment, the two armies had already begun to engage in close combat. The dwarven shield-wielding infantrymen jumped down from the bow of the ship and waded along the river to set up a defense. Behind them, two dwarven craftsmen jumped down and tried to nail the metal chain into the ground to secure the pontoon bridge. Of course, the Golden Lion Legion would not allow the enemy to complete the last step so easily. Under the command of the officer, the infantrymen on the beach began to slowly advance and launch an attack. As the Golden Lion Legion moved forward, the war drums on both sides of the river intertwined, and war cries finally rang out. The two sides clashed on the beach. Swords, spears, and swords flashed. Shouts of killing filled the air. Arrows flew everywhere. Countless soldiers screamed and fell to the ground. Blood flowed freely. Soon, it dyed a large area of water near the beach red. An endless stream of dwarven soldiers crossed the pontoon bridge and joined the formation, doing their best to block the Golden Lion Legion's attack. However, they were still at a disadvantage in numbers, and the beach was soon filled with people. However, the shield-wielding infantrymen were constantly pushed back, and the dwarven soldiers behind quickly gathered together, making it even harder for the soldiers on the pontoon bridge to charge out. The Golden Lion Legion's attack was fierce, and it looked like they would push the enemy into the river in one go. It had to be said that although the dwarven craftsmen were excellent, they could not make up for the difference in combat strength. The dwarves were not weak, but the disadvantage of their height made it difficult for them to use their strength. After all, it was easier to slash down from above. They were also not like the half-elves, who did not have nimble movements or amazing archery. Therefore, the dwarves were usually at a disadvantage when fighting against human armies. Of course, there were many factors that determined victory on the battlefield, and the combat strength of the soldiers was not the only factor. Moreover, the The battle had only just begun, and neither side had put in their main forces yet. This could only be considered a warm-up. However, the setback that the vanguard encountered made Marquis Dawson frown. After all, this was a general who had been following Marquis Garcia on his expeditions. He was already used to the invincible might of the Blackguards. Now that he saw that his troops were having such a hard time fighting a battle to land on the beach, he was instantly displeased. Tumu, you will personally lead the army across the river. I want to see your flag planted on the land on the other side in an hour. Sir. A dark-skinned muscular dwarf immediately knocked on his breastplate with a thunderous sound. Afterwards, he led his troops onto the pontoon bridge. It was visible to the naked eye that the water level of the pontoon bridge had deepened. This was because the dwarf General Tumu was leading heavy infantry. Chapter 246. Kill. A dwarven general clad in heavy armor jumped down from the ship. As soon as he got off, an arrow flew towards his eyes. However, he only tilted his head slightly, letting the arrow hit his helmet with a clang. Soon after, the strongest warrior of the Dawson clan let out a furious roar, smashing the hammer in his hands viciously against the ground. Asterisk boom. Asterisk a violent shockwave spread out, and the soft beach immediately caved in. It was as if a giant underground beast had opened its mouth and swallowed the hundreds of Golden Lion Legion soldiers. Tumu laughed maniacally, roaring like a beast. Charge! Tear these humans to shreds! This valiant warrior of the 5th rank greeted the Golden Lion Legion in his own way as soon as he appeared. A large gap was torn open in the Golden Lion Legion's dense formation. Tumu led the charge, and the dwarven heavy infantry behind him roared as they charged into the Golden Lion Legion's formation. The Golden Lion Legion's front line was constantly pushed back by the dwarven heavy infantry. Their swords and bows were unable to break through the defense of the heavy armor. In order to cause any damage to the dwarven heavy infantry, they needed a special weapon, a warhammer. However, Knight Campbell hadn't expected the dwarves to send their most elite heavy infantry to the battlefield so quickly, so he didn't send the Warhammer Company to the front lines. In a short period of time, the Golden Lion Legion's front line was continuously pushed back. The dwarven heavy infantry were like sharp blades that stabbed into the human formation, leaving bloody trails in their wake. The valor of the elite dwarven troops was vividly displayed at this moment. More and more dwarven infantry crossed the pontoon bridge, finally gaining a foothold in the shallow waters. Knight Campbell couldn't sit still any longer. He hurriedly ordered the Warhammer Company to charge forward and send more soldiers to seize the front line. However, Colin shook his head and stopped Knight Campbell. Don't be hasty. Let the frontline troops withdraw first. The front line will be given to the dwarves. Knight Campbell hesitated for a moment, but then he remembered that Viscount Angley was said to be Marquis Garcia's most valued general, and that he had won consecutive victories in Silvery Moon City and the Troll Empire. Of course, he wasn't a layman who didn't understand military affairs. Yes. Wizard Cusius, who had been pretending to be invisible, suddenly spoke up. Viscount Angley, if you need me, I can help you destroy the dwarves' pontoon bridge. Colin was surprised as he turned around and looked at Vera's teacher from head to toe. After a short while, he smiled and said, "What is the price that you have to pay to help me?" "There's no price." Cusius smiled and shook his head, his face full of sincerity. However, Colin thought to himself, free is the most expensive. He didn't know what Wizard Kudos was planning, but he didn't let his guard down. For now, there's no need to trouble you. The Golden Lion Legion is capable of dealing with a mere Dawson clan. In fact, Colin's plan was to let a portion of the dwarven army cross the river and then attack them halfway. In this battle of resistance, his plan was to give the Dawson clan a painful beating. This way, when the Golden Lion Legion retreated, the Dawson clan wouldn't dare to cross the river and chase after them. If Cusius destroyed the pontoon bridge or defended the front line so that the dwarves couldn't cross the river, then they wouldn't be able to cause enough casualties to the dwarven army. Although allowing the dwarves to gain a foothold at the front line would make the following battle more difficult, this was a price that had to be paid. Scholar Dwayne had helped Colin determine the strategy of defending, But when it came time to take the initiative to attack, Colin would not hesitate. Moreover, the more you wanted to retreat, the more you wanted to make the enemy think that you wanted to fight to the death. Therefore, Colin was prepared to fight this battle as a decisive battle. As the Golden Lion Legion retreated, more and more dwarven soldiers crossed the bridge and gradually formed a formation on the south bank of the river. However, they didn't rashly chase after them. Instead, they waited for more of their allies to cross the river. On the opposite bank, Marquis Dawson saw that his army had successfully occupied the front lines so quickly and immediately laughed. The Golden Lion Legion is only SOSO. The dwarven officer on the side also laughed and said, "After all, it was chaotic last night. They're probably dozing off right now. Still, we can't let our guard down." Marquis Dawson's smile disappeared and he sternly said, "Tell Tumu to guard the front line well and not to attack rashly." After the bloody battle at the beginning, the battlefield suddenly quieted down, as if it had entered the intermission period. More and more dwarves crossed the river. In the afternoon, the number of dwarves crossing the river had exceeded 10,000. Moreover, they began to build simple fortifications on the front line, preparing to build a bridgehead. Of course, the Golden Lion Legion wasn't idle either. Colin first let the soldiers eat their fill. Then, he arranged for some sentries to guard against any sudden attacks from the dwarves. After that, he let the main force return to the camp to catch up on sleep. After all, after the chaos last night, most of the soldiers weren't in their best condition. Colin saw that the dwarves were busy crossing the river and building fortifications, so he let his soldiers rest and recover their energy. Originally, he was worried that the dwarves would send out small groups to harass them, but until 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the dwarves still didn't have any intention of attacking. Colin immediately understood that Marquis Dawson on the opposite bank was a cautious and conservative commander. This could be guessed. After all, Marquis Dawson was mainly in charge of logistics in the Black Cavalry. Of course, he couldn't have a radical personality. Being cautious and conservative wasn't a weakness, but if he was too cautious and hesitated when seeing a suitable opportunity, then the opportunity would slip through his fingers. Moreover, in Colin's opinion, if Marquis Dawson really chose a conservative strategy, then he shouldn't have chosen to cross the river. Instead, he should have continued to wait for the Menham family's army to arrive. Once he chose to cross the river, he would be at a disadvantage strategically. This was because the Rapids River would naturally divide the dwarves' army into 2 parts. It was impossible to rely on the pontoon bridge to connect the 2 parts of the army together. Now, it seemed that the dwarves' crossing of the river was going smoothly. However, when the Golden Lion Legion launched their attack, they would taste the pain of not being able to advance and not being able to retreat. Marquis Dawson would also understand that he had missed the best opportunity to defeat the Golden Lion Legion. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Golden Lion Legion had already finished their sleep and regrouped. Colin held Vera's hand as they stood on a temporarily built platform. There were 2 coffins beside them. One of them contained the body of the Duke of St. Hilda, and the other contained the body of Charles St. Hilda. The reason why the 2 bodies were placed in quotation marks was because they were not real bodies. The body of the Duke of St. Hilda was a stone statue that had been swapped out, and Charles St. Hilda was not completely dead yet. "Go ahead," Colin said as he let go of Vera's hand. His eyes were full of encouragement. Vera nodded gently before she walked to the front of the platform alone. The 2 coffins were placed behind her, and the afternoon sun shone through the clouds. It seemed as though she was covered with a layer of holy halo. "My father is dead. My brother is dead as well." Vera's clear but firm voice spread throughout the wilderness through a sound amplification spell. Just these 2 sentences were enough to make the Golden Lion Legion soldiers feel ashamed. They had always claimed to be the shield of St. Hilda, but they had never succeeded in protecting their lord. Vera continued speaking. "However, I believe that my father and my brother did not hold any grudges before they died. This is because, just like all the other St. Hildas, they swore to protect the northern frontier. They were willing to sacrifice their lives for the northern frontier. So am I. No matter how strong the rebels are, no matter how terrible the enemy is, I will never allow the people of the northern frontier to fall into endless war." I will never allow this land to be filled with evil and killing. Warriors of the Golden Lion Legion, are you willing to fight with me for the northern frontier? We swear to protect the northern frontier, Knight Campbell shouted as he stood below the platform. We swear to protect the northern frontier. We swear to protect the northern frontier. One after another, the voices gradually converged into a slogan that resounded throughout the land. The sound of the rushing river gradually became noiseless. Colin narrowed his eyes as he looked at Vera, who was receiving the cheers of tens of thousands of soldiers of the Golden Lion Legion. In a trance, he seemed to see the figure of another woman, the half-elf queen, Aisha Miller. It seemed that Vera had indeed learned a lot from her time in Silvermoon City. Colin firmly believed that with the passage of time and the richness of her experiences, Vera would gradually grow into a qualified ruler of the northern region. Chapter 247. The sky suddenly turned gloomy. The sun seemed to have sensed the impending war and was so scared that it hid in the dark clouds. The air pressure suddenly became very low, so low that it was difficult to breathe. This kind of suffocating feeling made people want to find something to vent. At this time and place, killing people was undoubtedly a good way to vent. Dong dong dong. In the dull sound of military drums, the vanguard of the Golden Lion Legion began to approach the dwarves' position on the river bank. Then, when they were about 500 steps away, they suddenly accelerated and charged forward. Wild howls resounded throughout the earth. Tall and strong figures wearing heavy armor and holding swords rushed towards the dwarves' neatly arranged shield wall like monsters from the wilderness. Some of them were directly pierced by the spears, some were bounced back by the shield wall, and some broke through the wall with brute force. This decisive battle started very suddenly, but it was particularly decisive. As soon as the battle started, it was over and the bloody and cruel climax was presented in front of everyone. Vera's mobilization before the battle and the two corpses in the house of St. Hilda had completely ignited the courage in the hearts of the soldiers of the Golden Lion Legion. Therefore, as soon as the battle started, they rushed to the enemy's position like wild beasts that had broken free from their shackles and vowed to avenge the two St. Hildas. Of course, the dwarves' counterattack was also fierce. For thousands of years, the dwarves had been a vassal race of humans. Generation after generation, they were engaged in forging, construction, brewing, and other chores to serve and contribute to humans. They were conscientious, but they were not without complaints. Before the establishment of the Empire of Light, the dwarves had their own independent country. However, when the Holy Knights were invincible, the dwarves had to lower their proud heads in order to continue their race. Now, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity had appeared in front of them. The northern frontier was in chaos, and the St. Thean family and the San Lorenzo family had reached a tacit agreement to give the dwarves a chance to establish their own country. Such an opportunity was the only relief that the dwarves of the past had been searching for. It was the only hope for them to bathe in the supreme glory of the dwarf king. Therefore, every dwarf warrior was willing to sacrifice everything for this opportunity. When enemies meet on a narrow path, the courageous would win. The two sides were like two red-eyed fighting bulls, completely entangled with each other, vowing to decide the victor. The battle cries grew louder and louder, and the battle became more and more desperate. More and more people fell, but more and more people rushed forward. Blood began to flow freely, and life was quickly fading away. Rumble! A bolt of lightning pierced through the sky, followed by the deafening sound of thunder. Not long after, raindrops began to fall. Of course, this little drizzle was unable to extinguish the intense flames of war on the southern bank of the river. At this time, both sides were completely entangled. The flowing blood and the corpses on the ground stimulated the ferocity of the soldiers, turning them into beasts that only knew how to kill. Suddenly, as if there was a cold current, the raindrops that fell on the dwarves' positions suddenly turned into sharp icicles. If there was no armor on their heads, they would immediately be smashed to pieces. When the soldiers of the Golden Lion Legion saw this, they burst into cheers and their attacks became much fiercer. This was because they knew that Miss Vera was fighting side by side with them. However, this spell didn't last for long. Vera, who was at the rear, had already begun to pant, and her blonde hair was beginning to turn white. "Well, you can rest for a while. Leave the rest to me," Colin said as he held Vera's cold hand. Vera was stunned, and then she saw that Roger had already led 1,000 black cavalry soldiers to gather behind Colin. "Are you going to attack?" Vera was worried and she wanted to dissuade him, but she didn't know what to say. Colin nodded with a firm expression on his face. "Of course. I am also a knight of the northern frontier, and it is my duty to protect the northern frontier." Vera's eyes instantly turned red, and in a trance, she felt as if she had returned to a year ago. At that time, they were also on the banks of the Rapids River, and they were being chased by the Demon Wolf Cavalry. At that time, Colin had also taken the initiative to stand up and take the lead to rush to the front, and he had almost lost his life because of it. "Then you must be careful." Vera did not try to dissuade Colin. Instead, she took the initiative to step forward, tiptoed, and gave him a deep kiss. It was a little salty. After their lips parted, Colin saw that Vera's face was covered in tears. "If you die in battle, I will follow you and return to the arms of the God of Light." Colin's heart was filled with warmth as he listened to Vera's solemn promise. He believed that Vera was serious when she said this. Suddenly, Colin realized that there was a woman in this different world who was willing to sacrifice her life for him. "Don't worry," Colin said with a smile. "I am afraid that the person who can kill me has not been born yet." At this time, Knight Campbell seemed to be influenced by Colin's behavior, and he immediately shouted, "Lord Viscounts, please allow me to fight by your side." Colin raised his eyebrows, and he was somewhat impressed by the new commander of the Golden Lion Legion that he had just promoted. It seemed that he was indeed a loyal follower of the House of St. Hilda. However, Colin slowly shook his head and said, "The Golden Lion Legion needs a commander, Knight Campbell. Please let me have the glory of the Golden Lion Legion." "Yes, Lord Viscounts." Knight Campbell slammed his fist on his chest and bowed respectfully to Colin. From this moment onwards, he began to truly recognize Colin. Originally, Knight Campbell had some opinions about Colin. He thought that this person was trying to control the Golden Lion Legion through Vera, but now he suddenly felt that there was nothing wrong with the Golden Lion Legion following the orders of a knight who was willing to sacrifice himself for the northern frontier. "Lord Viscounts, do you need my help to destroy the pontoon bridge on the river?" At this time, the mage Cusius stood up again. Colin turned around and looked at the white-robed mage, but he still refused with a smile. "I am sorry, Sir Mage. This is a battle that belongs to the knights." The more Cusius took the initiative to please him, the more Colin wanted to keep a distance from him. Moreover, destroying the pontoon bridge at this time would be a foolish action. A pontoon bridge would not make the flowing river smooth. Even if it was intact, the dwarves would not be able to send a large number of troops across the river in a short time. However, if the pontoon bridge was destroyed, it was equivalent to completely cutting off the path of retreat for the dwarves who had already crossed the river. Wouldn't this be giving the other party a chance to fight to the death? Of course, Colin was not sure if the dwarves on the south bank would have the courage to fight to the death, but he was not willing to take the risk. After rejecting Cusius' good intentions, Colin immediately turned around and ordered the cavalry gathered behind him. "Black cavalry, dismount." The soft soil of the river was not suitable for cavalry to fight. However, the dismounted black cavalry was still the strongest army on the northern frontier. After hearing Colin's order, more than 1,000 black cavalry soldiers dismounted without hesitation. Colin asked loudly, "Without your war horses, do you still dare to charge with me?" More than 1,000 black cavalry soldiers shouted in unison. There was no hesitation, no fear, only an indomitable will to win. Colin used a deep gaze to slowly scan the faces of every black cavalry soldier. "Then let us use facts to prove that the secret of the black cavalry's invincibility is not war horses, but courage and faith. Black cavalry, listen to my command." Colin drew his blade of judgment and roared. Chapter 248. When Colin first saw Marquis Garcia personally leading the black cavalry, He could not understand why Marquis Garcia would do such a thing. This was because such an action was too risky. If something went wrong, the commander would be killed, captured, or even injured and could not continue to command the army. If that happened, the army would instantly lose its backbone and there would be no room for them to turn the situation around. However, after personally leading the Black Cavalry, Collins suddenly understood why Marquis Garcia would always take the lead in every battle. The commander-in-chief was the guts and soul of an army. When Marquis Garcia took the lead and charged at the front, the morale of the Black Cavalry was extremely high. More importantly, once the morale of this terrifying army was stimulated, they would be invincible and unstoppable. There was no need to worry about the commander being injured in the charge. After Colin tried to lead the Black Cavalry several times with his immortality, he was deeply addicted to the feeling of leading the Black Cavalry. The exhilaration of tearing apart the enemy formation like a hot knife through butter was as addictive as nicotine. At this time, the 1,000 Black Cavalry soldiers dismounted from their horses and fought on foot. However, under the personal leadership of Colin, they still showed a daunting momentum and rushed towards the dwarves like a sharp arrow leaving the bow. Because Colin was wearing a bright armor and there were people holding the commander's flag beside him, the soldiers of the Golden Lion Legion also knew that Vera's husband, Viscount Angley, had personally joined the battle. Therefore, the morale of the soldiers of the Golden Lion Legion was suddenly stimulated. The situation of the battlefield changed almost visibly, especially when Colin personally led the Black Cavalry to tear through the dwarves' first line of defense in an almost unreasonable way. It was as if the first domino had been pushed down. For a time, the dwarven army began to retreat step by step. The battle entered the most tragic stage. The riverbank was covered with corpses, and the river was completely dyed red. The unknown ferocious fish in the water excitedly jumped out of the water and enjoyed the bloody feast. The retreat of the dwarven army forced the soldiers at the back to retreat uncontrollably. However, if they retreated any further, they would be forced to retreat into the turbulent river. Seeing that the situation was about to collapse, General Tumu, whom Marquis Dawson had high hopes for, stood up. "Don't retreat. Follow me, go forward, go forward." Boom, boom, boom. Tumu raised the giant hammer in his hand and repeatedly smashed it on the ground, creating a deep pit. A huge shock wave spread out in all directions, disrupting the formation of both sides, but it also stopped the momentum of the Golden Lion Legion's charge. Tumu's violent posture immediately attracted Colin's attention. Although he had always believed that unless one reached the sanctuary realm, the role of high-ranking professionals in a war was limited. However, in a situation where both sides were evenly matched, the terrifying combat power of high-ranking warriors could still greatly boost morale and even turn the tide of the battle. Therefore, Colin immediately locked onto this dwarf warrior as his target. Tumu also saw Colin, who was not far away in bright armor. Although he did not recognize Colin, he knew that he was a big fish. Thus, he roared and took heavy steps forward. Like a monster made of steel, he rushed over. Colin sneered, holding his sword with both hands and meeting him fearlessly. Asterisk bang bang bang. Asterisk Tumu's footsteps became heavier and heavier, and the footprints behind him became deeper and deeper. It was as if his weight was constantly increasing as he charged. In the end, the whole earth seemed to tremble with his footsteps. However, Colin was not afraid at all, nor did he dodge. 100 steps. 50 steps. 20 steps. He was getting closer, even closer. Colin could clearly see the bloodthirsty and ferocious smile on Tumu's face. However, in the next second he suddenly stopped his charge. This change from extreme movement to extreme stillness made Tumu slightly stunned. However, driven by inertia, Tumu could no longer stop. There was no need for him to stop. In Tumu's opinion, this human general was scared. However, at such a distance, whoever was scared would die. Tumu let out a crazy laugh, raising the giant hammer in his hand high, as if he could already see the scene of Colin's head being smashed by him in the next second. Asterisk bang. Asterisk Tumu took the last step, and his body leaped high. The giant hammer in his hand was like a meteorite falling from the sky, smashing towards Colin. However, at this moment, A huge figure suddenly rushed out from behind Colin. His whole body was covered in black armor, not revealing a single bit of skin. He held a shield in his left hand and a spear in his right. His whole body was like a towering mountain standing in front of Colin. Asterisk boom. Asterisk there was a loud noise. Tuma's giant hammer smashed heavily on the armored man's giant shield, and the heavy steel shield was even smashed deeply. The huge impact caused the armored man's legs to sink deeply into the mud of the river bank, but his body was as steady as Mount Tai. A trace of astonishment and a touch of seriousness flashed in Tuma's eyes. However, in the next moment, his face was instantly filled with fear. This was because a long spear pierced out from behind the giant shield like a dragon out of the water, and Tumu, who was still in midair, could not dodge it. Asterisk G. Asterisk the long spear pierced through Tumu in midair. Under the intense pain, Tumu let out a beast-like roar. Then, without caring about his serious injuries, he raised the giant hammer and smashed it down again. Asterisk boom. Asterisk the giant shield, which was already broken, could no longer resist the bombardment of the giant hammer. In an instant, it turned into countless pieces of iron and scattered in all directions. The giant hammer, under the terrifying inertia, smashed heavily on the armored man's helmet. The helmet was instantly deformed, and blood gushed out like a fountain. However, the armored man did not seem to feel any pain. He waved his spear and smashed Tumu into the ground, then stepped on him. Tumu only felt that his armor was groaning under the heavy weight of the opponent's giant foot. However, he just noticed that under the twisted helmet, there was a bit of dark green skin and a glimpse of ferocious fangs. The opponent was a troll warrior. Tumu was full of doubts. Why would a troll help the Golden Lion Legion? Surrender and I'll give you face. Colin's cold voice sounded. Bah! Tumu spat out a mouthful of blood and said disdainfully, only dead dwarven warriors don't surrender, bang. Colin kicked Tumu's head heavily, knocking him out. Tuma's fall was a fatal blow to the dwarven army's morale. Under the circumstances where Marquis Dawson had not crossed the river, this fifth-rank dwarf warrior was the backbone of the dwarven army on the south bank. At this moment, seeing that the incomparably valiant General Tumu had been stepped on, and it was unknown whether he was dead or alive, panic immediately began to spread among the dwarves. And when the battle reached its climax, such panic was fatal. On the Golden Lion Legion side, their morale was greatly boosted. The soldiers fearlessly charged forward, charging forward, and charging forward again. Under the tide-like attack, the dwarves could only retreat step by step. However, this retreat only made their situation worse. This was because behind them was the turbulent flowing river. Although there were still more dwarven troops coming to the south bank along the pontoon bridge, they could not have too much of an impact on the current battle situation. This was because they had already been blocked by their allies who were trying to retreat, and they could not display their true potential as a fresh force. This would only make the river bank more crowded and chaotic. Even worse, the dwarven army that had gathered together became living targets for the archers of the Golden Lion Legion. Arrows rained down like a storm, reaping the lives of the dwarven soldiers with great efficiency. Charge! Charge forward! We can't retreat! We can't retreat anymore! The dwarven officers roared at the top of their lungs, trying to salvage the situation. However, in this situation, individual strength was so weak and powerless. Sometimes, it was not that the soldiers wanted to retreat, but that they had no choice. With the collapse of the front lines, the dwarves' living space was compressed, and they could not carry out orderly replacement and rotation. The army at the back could not charge forward, and the army at the front lines was already exhausted. A large-scale rout was already unstoppable. Splash, splash. Dwarven soldiers had already begun to be pushed into the water. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.